This is a ship's biscuit. It's hardtack. It's pure condensed nutrition. If you take a family road trip today, maybe 500 miles, you definitely pack clothing, maybe some recreational gear, a laptop. You don't need to worry about food. You can travel and stop any number of times along the way. Gas stations, grocery stores, fast food restaurants, they are everywhere when we travel today. If you're traveling in the 18th century, that is never true. You have to bring your food along with you. You never know when you might be able to find food or not. If you're a sailor on the high seas, there's no place to get food. You have to bring along every bit that you need. And it needs to be able to last through multiple different kinds of temperatures, in different situations. It needs to be condensed. It needs to be nutritious. I'm amazed by the resourcefulness of our forefathers in creating ship's biscuits. They check off all the difficulties on this list. I even have a ship's biscuit here that is 10 years old and it's still probably edible. I'm gonna try this at the end of the episode. So what is a ship's biscuit? How is it made? Ship's biscuits are so very, very simple. They are an unleavened bread. We just take 2 or 3 ingredients. You just need flour, you need a little bit of water, and maybe sometimes salt. You make a very, very stiff dough, and you form it into these little biscuit shapes, and they're baked. And they're baked by the baker at a fairly low temperature and for a very long time. What we're trying to achieve here is a hardened disc of baked dough with almost no moisture in it. Moisture is the enemy of a ship's biscuit. It will cause it to get moldy. It will also attract insects. If this is dry, desiccated, there's nothing here for bugs to eat, and it just doesn't go bad. So it's easy to imagine a ship's voyage, and on board ship are barrels and barrels of ship's biscuits. How are they going to eat these? Sailors know when they sign up that this is the bread they're going to get each and every day. In fact, rations for a sailor every day includes a pound of bread. So they may get 6, 7, 8 ship's biscuits depending on how big they are. There are accounts where sailors don't even like soft bread. After they're used to eating these for a long period of time, they think the soft bread is actually going to be bad for them. All that air in the bread will make their stomach not digest properly. And so this is what they crave each and every day. But it's not just sailors that have to endure ship's biscuits each and every day. Soldiers are also dealing with ship's biscuits constantly. 18th century soldiers are in situations where ship's biscuits are part of their ration, especially as a substitute, and maybe not an everyday thing. Joseph Plum Martin during the Revolutionary War talks about coming up to a situation where they didn't have regular bread to give out, and so they had opened up a cask of ship's bread and say, take as much as you want. So each soldier stuffed all these ship's biscuits into their shirts and into their pockets as much as they could. As we move westward toward the Mississippi, frontiersmen, explorers, and settlers are using ship's biscuits as part of their provision. They are surviving on this very same thing. We also see it as a commodity used to trade with the Native Americans. Later on in the 19th century, during the Civil War, soldiers had to deal with ship's biscuit the same way they did earlier, but they generally referred to it as hard bread, bread, or hardtack. If you read in the diaries, you don't see the word hardtack showing up very often. I think they just plain referred to it as bread, and if they got regular bread like we know it today, they would say something special in the diary like, I got soft bread today. Through our time period where ship's biscuits become more and more important, the making of them changes. So early on, individual bakers are making ship's biscuits. Later on in the 18th century, it becomes more industrialized, and they set up bakeries right close to the ship ports. There are 5 or 6 people working on the making of ship's biscuits, and they might have 9 ovens going and teams of men making these biscuits. It turns out that they need thousands and thousands of them for maybe just an individual ship. So the demand is very, very great. And by the time we get into the 19th century, it's totally industrialized and machines are making them from start to finish. You'll probably say, John, is this really nutritional? Now, think about the flour in the 18th century versus flour today. These biscuits were made with the least expensive flour. Whole wheat flour, sometimes other kinds of inexpensive flours thrown in. In fact, probably much more nutritional than we can imagine. This was just meant to get you through the day. This was survival food, not trying to give you this complete wonderful nutrition that we are always thinking of today. People in the 18th century didn't have those same kinds of nutritional concepts. If we look at cookbooks in the 18th century, we will not find a recipe for ship's biscuits. They're made by the baker. They're not made in a house. And the bakers generally hand these processes down. They don't write them out. So they'll give it to your apprentice to make, and he'll make 1,000 ship's biscuits or whatever. It's also an industrial process. We do get descriptions of this, especially as the process gets more and more mechanized, and we get descriptions of the archaic method of making ship's biscuits. I've got a couple of pounds of whole wheat flour, and we're going to mix that with just enough water to make a nice stiff dough. It's going to take a little bit to get this incorporated properly. Mix it in a bowl, it makes it a little bit easier. I really want to make sure this dough ball is complete. It doesn't have cracks in it, any folds where there is any unincorporated flour, because at those points, the dried biscuit will fall apart. It will crack and break, and we don't want that. So we want this to be a nice, solid biscuits. If they fall apart en route, we haven't done what we needed to do. I'm going to try a couple of different techniques here kneading. One of them is to use our rolling pin as a brake to really work this dough over and get it to be very, very smooth. And once that's done, we can start to rip it up into those larger than egg size pieces. After those pieces are made, we can form our little biscuit shapes. We're looking for a hockey puck kind of style here. They are turning out very, very consistently. Since this isn't an industrial kind of situation, I'm not selling these ship's biscuits. They can vary in size a little bit. That's okay, especially for personal use. As we're forming up the biscuits, realize that these are not going to grow as they bake. If anything, they'll shrink just a little bit. So we're forming these biscuits up almost exactly the size that we want them to be when we use them. We're poking holes consistently across our biscuits and all the way to the bottom, and we're doing that so that it releases the moisture throughout the entire biscuit as it's baking, especially if they bake fairly rapidly, because what will happen is steam builds up in the inside of the biscuit and it will just sort of pop the top and create holes and gaps in our biscuit. In one sense, that's exactly what we want, because we want it to be easier to eat. But in the case of a ship's biscuit, where we want it to stay together until we're ready to eat it, we don't want any air gaps, we don't want any holes, and so we poke these holes and the steam will come out through those instead of puffing it up. I've baked many batches of these, and I've used several different techniques trying to find the best way. These take at least 2 bakes, if not 3 or 4, or you can do one very long bake at a low temperature. That's probably the best way to do it. We don't want that steam to build up, so if we bake them very, very slowly, that steam has a chance to get out of the biscuit without it breaking and cracking. So I would say the best way to do it is about 250 degrees for 3 or 4 hours. You might need to bake them for a while and then lower that temperature. Maybe bake them for an hour at 250 degrees, lower that temperature. I've even baked them overnight at just kind of the warm temperature in a modern oven. Ship's biscuits show up in multiple different literary references. This is from Swift's Family Robinson. We refreshed ourselves with wine and biscuit, which we found in some of the casks. Whenever we have bread or biscuits coming out of a barrel, we know they are ship's biscuits. The trick with ship's biscuits is you can't just eat them. You will break your teeth. So we don't want to eat that. This is our 10-year-old ship's biscuit. I'll try this last. We have our ship's biscuits that we just made, and we can use them in lobscouse. So you can check that episode out where we just ate them in the Sailor's Feast. We also have broken up a little bit of ship's biscuit and soaked it in wine. And Here we're using it like cereal. So I've broken up the ship's biscuit by pounding it and then pouring it into hot chocolate. And that's another popular drink from the time period. Let's start with this chocolate cereal. Probably needs to soak a little bit longer, but reminds me of cocoa wheats. It's actually really good. It's got a nice little bit of tooth and a wonderful chocolate flavor. The biscuit soaked in wine, I'm kind of surprised. You can see how soft it is at this point. It's only soaked about 10 or 15 minutes. This is a little bit of Madeira, very common 18th century wine. Very nice and soft, eats easily, and this could be dessert. So it's a bit of a dessert wine. You could soak this in water or in grog. Here's the big trouble, right? This ship's biscuit is over 10 years old. It's got all these extra little holes in it. I didn't make all these holes. Some of these holes are made by bugs, which is a common problem with ship's biscuits. And this one is a pretty hard one. It has been around this long, kind of a little overcooked, but let's break this, see what the inside is like. There we go. There's our ship's biscuit on the inside. There's some bugs in there, some little white larvae, which is a common problem in the 18th century. Sailors, they would tap the biscuits on the table to knock the bugs out or eat them in the dark because they didn't want to know what they were eating. But let me see if I can get a little bit of it here. Tastes almost exactly like the brand new ship's biscuit. Still, after 10 or 12 years, it's just as edible as it was before. Maybe a little added protein. One of the most common questions on this channel has to do with what kind of food is available in the 18th century that we don't have today in the 21st century. Truly, one of the very most common foods in the 18th century was salt pork. And today, we really, right here in America, don't have anything quite like it at all. If you go to the grocery store, you will find something that is called salt pork, but it's nothing like 18th century salt pork. Imagine a food that everyone in the 18th century is familiar with, whether you're the poorest person or the richest person. It might not be on your table as the very richest person, but you would be very, very familiar with it. It is something that's used by sailors, soldiers, anyone who is doing exploring. Common laborers are going to be eating salt pork all the time. And even in a typical household, it's something that you would prepare for your own family, or you could find it in the marketplace. Imagine something that's so common that the prices are listed in the newspaper like stock prices might be listed today. So, what's the price of salt in Boston? You would be able to find that out in any common newspaper. What is 18th century salt pork? There are many, many descriptions of it, even sort of recipes for it, and I've got this simple recipe, and it is very simple, from 1736. This is Nathaniel Bailey in his Dictionarium Domesticum, and he says, an excellent way of salting meat. Let your meat be fresh, and take out all the bleeding arteries, then sprinkle it with common salt and let it lie in the air for 12 hours. But take care to salt the pieces where the arteries are more particularly. Then wipe the meat dry and make some salt very hot over the fire and rub it into the meat very well and lay the pieces of salted meat one upon another, and it will keep for several months. Or with common salt, rub the several pieces of meat briskly with it after the blood is out, and lay salt enough in the hollow places especially, so will you be sure to have your meat sweet, either beef or pork. So this is a simple method here of something that you would do in your house. You might do this in a crock or some other small vessel. But salt pork is also an industrial product that is made in barrels. So thousands and thousands of barrels of salt pork would be prepared every year all around the Western world, and they would be sold into the marketplace to be used by all these different people at different times. So in an industrial setting, you would have a barrel, and many times this was if it's going to go into the marketplace, is going to be something that is regulated by your local government. And so we have the laws, say for like the colony of New York or Connecticut or Virginia. And they said, well, it has to be a certain size barrel. It has to be 32 gallons. It was a typical size. And you have to have so many pounds of meat in there. So there would be approximately 200 to 220 pounds of pork in that barrel. If it is the highest quality, there can only be so many kinds of cuts here of pork in your barrel. And that's another thing. Salt pork is not a particular cut, like bacon, right? No, it's the entire animal. So you might find feet, legs, front quarters, hind quarters, or a head in the barrel. So the best quality of pork barrel will only have 1 or 2 heads in that barrel. I know, we can't even imagine that today, right? It's like you're gonna open up this barrel, it's gonna have basically the whole hog in there, any of the different pieces you might find inside your barrel. But again, the regulations were there to keep you from opening up that barrel and finding all feet or something like that. We don't want that. So there was a grade, so the top grade only has particular kinds of cuts in it, and the lowest grade is sort of catch as catch can. You don't know what you're going to find. And there was also a grade that had basically the whole hog. You would find pieces of every type in that barrel, but you knew you weren't going to find too many of one kind or another. Salt pork is going to be available in different ways. So you might go to the marketplace and maybe you need an entire barrel or multiple barrels of salt pork. Or there might be situations where truly you don't need more than a week's worth of meat, or maybe you just don't have that much money. So you would buy pieces of salt pork that you could set by. So it isn't just, oh, I have to have an entire, 200 pounds of salt pork, but you could buy smaller pieces as well. Now, researching salt pork can sometimes be difficult because at times salt pork can go under many different names. When you see the word pork, you have to look at the context. Many times it just means salt pork. And if it means fresh pork, it will actually say fresh pork. It also goes by the name of barreled pork, because you can't put fresh pork in a barrel without it going bad. So it's salt pork. And there's something that's very similar and maybe exactly the same thing at times called pickled pork. So we see lots and lots of references for pickled pork in the 18th century also. So it's got all these different names and it shows up in so many different places. So if this is so popular in the 18th century, why is it popular? What's special about salt pork? Well, it has to do with how long it will last. Today, if we go to the grocery store and we buy pork, we have options. We can prepare it immediately. We can put it in the refrigerator as raw pork. We can even freeze it for next week, next year, whatever. They didn't have the options of refrigeration or freezing, so if they purchased fresh pork, it had to be prepared immediately. Depending on the atmosphere or the climate where you're at, you had to prepare it within a day or two, or it was going to go bad and you just throw it out. It would be a complete waste. Salt pork is totally different. At room temperature, it is stable and good for as long as a year. If you buy it, in a barrel and it's sealed up, it can be good easily for a year. If it's out of the barrel and you're buying an individual piece, well, it's still going to be good for a week or two, depending on how you store it. But that's an incredible difference between this piece of meat going bad in basically hours versus something that is shelf stable for up to a year. That is a tremendous advantage. So today we might think of like salt pork, it kind of tastes weird, it's not as good as fresh pork, so fresh pork should be more expensive. Not true in the 18th century. The longevity of salt pork was so important that your salt pork is going to be worth more, pound for pound, than fresh pork. So if salt pork is very, very popular, the question is does it taste good? Now, one of the reasons why it's popular is because it's longevity. It can stay, stable and not go bad. But is it good? Did they like it? Well, that's an interesting question. People don't necessarily talk so much about whether something is good or bad, but we do have some hints about how desirable it was as something to eat. So one of the other commodities that's being traded right along with salt pork is salt beef. Turns out that salt pork was generally worth more pound for pound than salt beef. Salt beef had a tendency to get very, very hard. So hard that you could carve it like wood. And you had to soak it for a long time. And even after you soaked salt beef for a long time, it still was very, very tough because that salt just makes the meat tougher. It's not true for pork. One of the very best meats to salt, and you can get away with, and it's still sweet and good, was salt pork. So it was desirable because, it might still not be as good as fresh. It's still much better than other salt provisions like salt beef. So much so that if you look at the rations that are given out to soldiers and sailors, generally a soldier or sailor might be given a pound of beef per day to eat, and the equivalent in pork would be 3/4 of a pound. So you like the pork so much that you're willing to eat less of it. Now, how hard was it to prepare? You take salt pork, you need to soak it. You need to try to get as much salt out as possible. And then you can generally boil it or use it in other dishes as, little portions of meat. But there are times when we find references to people in that 18th century context and they're eating it raw. I know, that is pretty hard to believe. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone today. But if you read in Joseph Plum Martin's memoirs, as he is a Revolutionary War soldier, he talks about one setting where everyone is just so tired after marching all day long and all they have are salt pork provisions that some of the men, they don't care, they just eat it raw. Joseph Plum Martin was one of those that said, I would rather just eat this probably not very tasty salt pork and just go to sleep. He was just so tired. Now, you could not take a piece of salt beef and just eat it raw. It was an impossibility. You would break your teeth. But apparently the salt pork was something that you could cut up easily and chew and digest. So salt pork is prepared in a lot of different places. They were creating barrels and barrels of salt pork in England and in Ireland, all along the eastern seaboard, whether you're up north in New York, Virginia, all these places are creating salt pork and exporting it because it's such a desirable, commodity. You just had to have it. But another place that's kind of interesting is that salt pork was actually coming out of the frontier. So salt pork was one of the first things that you could produce on newly settled land. It might take a while to produce corn as a cash crop, or wheat, or some other item like that. But on the frontier, they could turn hogs loose, and they would just forage in the woods, and then you could harvest those and turn them into salt pork and send them down the river in barrels and sell them in the marketplace at, say, New Orleans. So that's one of the first cash crops that's coming out of some place like Kentucky and some of those very, very interior places. Anybody can produce salt pork. It's such a simple process. All you need is the pork and a whole lot of salt and some vessel to store it in. Not all salt pork was made in these giant barrels to be shipped out to a marketplace and bought as an entire 200 pounds of salt. It was prepared in the home in smaller batches for shorter periods of time. So you might go to your local market and you might buy 10 or 15 pounds of pork. Again, you can't use it immediately. You can't cook it all right away. So you might need salt pork to last a week or 2 weeks, just in small batches. Or a couple of great diaries from the 18th century. Here's the diary of Joshua Hempstead. And he says, Thursday the 14th, it's fair. I was at home cutting and salting pork and making a chest for Christopher Darrow. It's a cold day. And so there you go. So he's talking about his diary where they're just doing a small portion of salt pork. This wasn't one of those, I mean, if he was doing barrels and barrels of them, he would have said, oh, this day I did it, and the next day I did it, and the next day. This circumstance, it only took a few hours. Here's Matthew Patton's diary, and his diary is very, very voluminous, wonderful reading here. This is November 30th. I cut up a pork, and my wife salted a barrel full of it in the out cellar, and John got a bushel of Indian corn and a bushel of rye ground at Lieutenant Daniel's mill. So here's a session where we're making a little bit larger portion. This is probably going to last them all winter into next spring. So, and notice the time of year, November 30th. A lot of this harvesting, especially if we're doing larger quantities of it, is going to be done in the very late fall and early winter time when it's cool outside. The meat isn't going to go off really quickly. So you have some time. We have examples where salt pork is trading hands in communities without necessarily being bought and sold. It's really being traded. So you'll find these interactions with people, I got 5 pounds of salt pork from my neighbor, and then, sometime later I paid them off in some other commodity totally different than that. So we do have salt pork being traded, used almost as currency. As we read about salt pork in the 18th century, we find that there are various regions who thought their salted pork was the best and other people's were inferior. You see that even reflected in some of the laws. So there are laws in New York that talk about the repackaging of salt pork. So one of the things that did happen is you needed to sort of see what's going on with the salt pork at times, so you might unbarrel it and rebarrel it, resalt it, and pick out the pieces that were going bad, especially after the first couple of weeks. So in the New York laws, it says if pork is repackaged and that pork came from someplace else, so maybe barrels of salt pork were coming in from Virginia and it got to New York and we're gonna rebarrel that, you couldn't mark the barrel as from New York. You had to say, this is pork from someplace else, because they didn't want their pork to get a bad name, because our pork is the best. Aboard ship, salt pork is one of those things that every sailor is going to be eating during the week. And it seems like almost every account we have of the rations for sailors is very, very similar, whether it's in the merchant marine or whether it's a military naval force. Here's a shipmaster's accountant book, and it's sort of, if you're going to be a shipmaster, here are the typical things that you're going to need to do. And here he talks about the weekly allowance that is given per man. He says, hence the full weekly allowance per man is 7 pounds of biscuit, 1 quart of peas, 7 gallons of beer, that's per week, 3 pints of oatmeal, 2 pounds of pork, and they mean salt pork, 6 ounces of butter, 4 pounds of beef, and 12 ounces of cheese. So that has to be spread out through the entire week, and generally on board ship, those things are given out in a particular schedule. So Tuesday might be beef, and then Thursday is going to be pork. There are going to be some days when meat isn't served at all. But this is very, very typical, and you'll find very similar accounts in just about every memoir, diary, and even the regulations you see for Congress saying what the naval rations should be. Soldiers in the 18th century are given fresh provisions, fresh meat whenever available. But salt pork is something that's also divvied out, especially at times when men have to go on the march for multiple days at a time. And they would be given their ration ahead of time. Instead of having to provide for these men as they're on the march, before they started the march, they would be given a ration of meat, like 3 or 4 or maybe 5 days worth of meat at that time. Now, that meat is not going to stay good, so you want to give them a salt provision. So they would be given salt provisions at those times so that that meat would be good even 4 and 5 days later. It's not just sailors, it's not just soldiers, but we have people that are trading deep into the interior. And here's a description of sort of voyageurs. This is a book called Travels in Lower Canada from 1797. On setting out, each man is furnished with a certain allowance of salted pork, biscuit, peas, and brandy. The peas and biscuit are boiled with some of the pork into a porridge, and a large vessel full of it is generally kept at the head of the bateau for use of the crew when they stop in the course of the day. So they were making this sort of stew that was available to you all day long, this cold stew of a peas biscuit, which is really just hard bread. They pounded that up and then cooked it with the salt pork. And it was one of those, you need a snack during the day, that's what you're going to eat. One of the most famous examples of using salt pork as an explorer are the Lewis and Clark expedition that goes out into what is now the Western United States in 1805, 1804. They go exploring this whole area, and they knew that there may not be food supplies available for them for maybe days and weeks at a time. So they have to take lots of provisions with them. They take salt pork along. And at times they would stop and cache salt pork. They would dig a hole in the ground, bury the salt pork, make a quick note about exactly where they might be able to find it in the future, and then cover it back up and hide it. You would do this in many different situations, different people, hunters and whatnot, because you would need an emergency supply of food that you could go back and find, or maybe even find on your way back from going, months or even years later. You'd come back and find this salt pork. So Lewis and Clark were doing that. It was an important food stock for them when regular food was not available. And there's this wonderful section here in August 12th of 1805. They say, here we halted and we breakfasted on the last of our venison. So that would be fresh deer, having yet a small piece of pork in reserve. So they didn't want to eat this salt pork right away. They were going to use whatever might go bad first. This salt pork might be good for weeks or months, so we're going to keep that in reserve. After eating, we continued on our route through the lower bottom of the main stream along the foot of the mountains on our right. The next day, we killed nothing during the day. We now boiled and ate the remainder of our pork, having yet a little flour and parched meal at the creek. So here it is. They ate their venison first. It could go bad. They kept their pork in reserve. No deer appeared the next day. There was nothing they could find to eat, so they had to eat the last of their salt pork. They were probably getting very worried. You can hear that in the words there. All we have left is a little bit of flour and a little bit of parched corn. They are up against it. They need to find something else. They're out of salt pork. There's a wonderful reference to salt pork in The Bark-Covered House. In his late teens, William Nolan was helping his family pay off the mortgage on their property. And so he was going on long hunting trips. He would be gone for a week, 2 weeks at a time. And he would take along salt pork. Why? Because they got tired of eating venison and they wanted a different flavor and something they could bring along to cook. And again, he needed some kind of a provision that wouldn't go bad as he was out into the woods 2 and 3 weeks at a time. As I researched food in the 18th century, You just never know when a topic like this is going to take you down paths you just never really thought. It's like any of these other things we research. We don't think twice about salt pork when we see references to it, when we read something going on, a sailor, a soldier in the time period. We don't realize how incredibly important this food item was. And we don't have anything like it today. It's completely gone. It's a flavor that we're missing. We just don't kind of realize. We have to try it out to even understand what it would taste like. I love digging deep on a topic like this because it can tell us a lot about what life was like in this time period. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm John Townsend. Today we're going to be experimenting with an 18th century dish called Burgoo. What is Burgoo? Thanks for coming along with us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So Burgoo is one of those terms that shows up if you study the life of sailors in the 18th century. It shows up in memoirs, in different sort of references, and sometimes even in dictionaries or plays, right? And I always read that stuff and I say, Burgoo, that sounds very exciting. It sounds very strange. What is it? They don't explain it. But I've got this wonderful memoir of a seafaring life by Spavins. He wrote this in 1796, and the great part about this book is later on he goes through and explains everything about a sailor's life in the 18th century. He was a sailor from I think 1755 all the way up through 1765, so it's a great section. And let me read to you about the food that sailors eat, or British sailors ate in the 18th century. In page 106, he talks about provisions here. He says, every man and boy born on the books of any of His Majesty's ships are allowed as following: a pound of biscuit bread and a gallon of beer per day. So a gallon of beer a day. Maybe that's not so bad, right? On Tuesdays and Saturdays, 2 pounds of beef, or else a pound of beef and a pound of flour with plums for pudding. Let's see. On Thursdays and Sundays, every 2 men has 3 pounds of pork and a pint of peas to boil them into a soup. The other 3 days are banyan days. Those are days without meat. Each one of those days, he gets 2 ounces of butter, a 1/4 pound of cheese. On Wednesdays, you get burgoo boiled for breakfast and a pint of peas to make soup for dinner. On Mondays, no peas, but you get burgoo for dinner. That's what you get when you're a sailor on board ship each and every week. 2 of those days we get burgoo. What is burgoo? Well, burgoo is ground oatmeal boiled up. Now, you would necessarily eat that all by itself. Early on, you were given to go with that salt beef fat. So the slush that came to the top of when you're boiling all your salt beef or salt pork, you get all that fat that goes up on top. They would scrape that off. They'd keep that and give it to you to go with your burgoo. But later on, they said maybe that caused scurvy, so they let you have some molasses instead. Let's make up some burgoo. So this is going to be so very, very simple. I've got some water boiling up here. I'm not even sure quite exactly how much, but probably about 4 or 5 cups. I'm going to add just a touch of salt, and it's likely on board ship they have all the salt they need, so they would add salt to this. Now you can imagine they're going to be cooking this in a giant copper vat because they have to cook food for even a small ship might have 50 or 60 men, a military ship. A frigate, 200 men, ship of the line, 400, 500, 600 men you're going to have to cook for. So we've got some oatmeal here that's already kind of ground up, and we're going to slowly add that and stir it. And the ratio on this is probably about 3 to 1 oatmeal to water. They might cook this up for a long time, let it get very, very thick. but you can imagine at other times they had to make this in a hurry, and it would be a thin gruel, depending on what their provisions were like, whether they were running low or not. So there's another term that shows up if you're reading about sailors' food, and that's loblolly, and that's actually an earlier term for the same thing. The same thing as burgoo. It really kind of means a frothing, bubbling, cooking mess. And so they would use that same term, and slowly over time they dropped that loblolly term, and burgoo became the name for the same thing. Okay, here's our burgoo. It's all done. I just added our molasses in there, and I mean, I can imagine that they might have used a blackstrap molasses, something with a lot of flavor that was very, very cheap for these sailors. I tried to use, I like baking molasses a little better than blackstrap, but that's it. It's really just oatmeal, water. We didn't use any milk. We didn't use any cream, and molasses boiled up. Let's find out how this burgoo turned out. Yeah, I can imagine, I can see all these sailors, they're all, at their tables, and they're eating up their, burgoo. It's good. It would keep you going. It would keep you energized for the day, and a very, very cheap ration. I'm not sure I can imagine it with a whole bunch of slush on it, that grease and oil from the top of the cooking thing. But if you're an officer, maybe you've got a special version of burgoo. You're going to add a little nutmeg to it just to give it a wonderful flavor, right? So let's add a little nutmeg. We're going to make our officer's version of burgoo. Find out what that's going to do to it. I'll bet you now it's going to be something special. Even the smell of nutmeg adds something to it. Now there you go. That is a wonderful burgoo. So this may have seemed like a super simple recipe, and it is, but it's so steeped in history. This wasn't just sailors' food. It was food for everyday folk all over. Soldiers are going to be eating something like this. Just regular folk everywhere, especially poor people. This is going to be a very, very common dish. So every time we dig into something like a nice, simple oatmeal, we can connect back with those people in the 18th century. We can live life just like them. And next time you're having oatmeal for breakfast, you can tell everybody, no, we're not having oatmeal. We're going to have burgoo. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we're talking about the sailor's favorite drink, grog. Thanks for coming along with us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. The major component, the important part of grog is rum, and rum was so very important to North America in the 18th century. It's a very vital, important item that's being traded with the West Indies all up and down the east coast of North America at the time. And it's not just important as a trade item, but it's important as part of the rations and provisions of sailors, of regular soldiers, and regular workers alike. So it's something that everyone in North America is experiencing, using, and making money off of, trading it back and forth. It's so very important to the war effort that in early 1776, Admiral Graves is sending out ships to go down to the West Indies to pick up rum because they're out of rum. It's vitally important to the fleet at that time. So he sends out a special ship to go. He actually has them tear out parts of the ship and get more kegs so they can fill the ship up with rum and bring it back because they are desperately in need of rum for their sailors, for their navy. It's the only way that people are going to work. Shipbuilding was going on during the Revolutionary War, and the shipbuilders were paid not only in just regular money, but in rum during the day. Each and every builder got his share of rum, just like he was a sailor or a soldier. So we find that they need to have this rum for everyone to be happy with their work. And there are multiple references to that idea of, it's their one solace in life. It's the only reason they have to keep going. Colonel Ethan Allen in captivity, at one point, he said the conditions were terrible, but they still had their provisions, their salt provisions, their salt beef, their salt pork, and they had their rum. And he thought that the rum was one of the only reasons why so many people survived in that particular situation. So they not only thought about it as something that was a solace in life, but as something that was medicinal. Rum was part of what was keeping them healthy. At least that's what he thought. The other main component of grog is water. And water in the 18th century was a tricky thing, wasn't it? You never were quite sure about whether your water was, safe, whether it was good. It was on board ship. You had to go and collect all this water. You put it in kegs. You stored it in the hold of your ship. And it wasn't very long at all, 2 or 3 weeks, a month later, and the water that you put in your kegs is going bad. It's getting green. It's doing all kinds of, microbes are growing in it. So the water goes bad very rapidly on board ship. And even if you are not on board ship, surface water can be a questionable item. So we find out that grog, making your water and your rum into grog, is very helpful because it sort of sterilizes your water. And in every reference to a ship's log, you'll find the ships, as soon as they come into any kind of a port, probably the very first thing they're thinking about if they have to leave soon is getting fresh wood and getting fresh water. You have to have water for your men, and your water is constantly going bad. So where does grog come from? Well, in the 17th century, the British Navy started to use rum in lieu of beer. If you were in home waters, the sailors would have a beer ration each and every day, but they also had these substitutes. If you weren't in home waters, you would have other items available, and rum started to become an obvious and consistent substitute. But the problem was that the sailors would hold back their rum ration for 2 or 3 days straight, maybe longer, and then they would drink it all at once and they would become intoxicated, and that was very dangerous on board ship. You had work to do, very dangerous work, hard work to do, and a fuddled mind was not helpful at all. So Admiral Vernon in the 1740s, he decided he would come up with a way that would make that harder for them to do and maybe make that rum a little less intoxicating. And he made sure to have their rum mixed with water in a 4-to-1 ratio. Made it harder to store back for any period of time, and hopefully he thought it would make them less intoxicated if they drank it in its diluted form. Now this term, it turns into this term of grog, and it turns into not just a naval drink, but a drink that other people would drink also. You'll find multiple references to this idea of grog from about 1750 on. And Admiral Vernon's nickname was Old Grog because of items he would wear, grogram cloth. And so that's where this grog term comes from, at least most people think. And grog keeps living on. It stays a part of the ration of sailors in the British Navy up until the 1970s, and it's part of the rations in the American Navy until about the Civil War or so. So not only is it right there happening in the Revolutionary War, but it stays on for 100 years later. So to mix these properly together, you really need a Jill cup. So the standard ration for almost every reference that you see is half a pint per man per day, and this was usually divided into 2 pieces. So we need a quarter of a pint or a half a cup. That's where the Jill cup comes into. That is half a cup. That's a half a cup measurement. And we created this mixture here probably probably a little stiffer than the standard ration here. And I'm gonna go ahead and add a little bit of lime to mine. And now we have our cup of grog, our standard. And you can imagine you'd have this twice a day, this full cup full. And it's actually quite a tasty little drink. It's so simple. It's just water and rum, and then just that hair of citrus in there. It's medicinal, obviously, with all that wonderful citrus in there. And it's a very, very palatable way to drink this. And you'll find just any number of references in the 18th century to not only sailors, but regular landsmen alike drinking a grog drink. Now, many times you'll see people using a drink like this as a way of convincing people, oh, come in and have a cup of grog with me. And then, of course, you'll find those in the court records. Something bad happened usually right after that. But grog was, so pervasive in the 18th century. Every man of war, every merchant ship, this was something that was commonly happening with all the hands on board. It is, the way that men are, it's one of the ways that they were kept happy at a job that was impossibly difficult and deadly at times, quite often. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm John Townsend. Today we are outside because we are cooking the stinkiest recipe yet, stockfish. Woo! Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So what is stockfish? Stockfish is dried cod. They catch cod, they gut it, and then they put it out to sort of dry out, freeze dry it almost, on these big racks in Norway. So you can imagine they have all these thousands and thousands of cod that are drying out in the cold weather. It takes months for these things to dry out completely. Stockfish is a very old type of food preservation technique. They've been doing this for over 1,000 years. Stockfish shows up in English literature. Shakespeare talks about stockfish. There are regulations and laws about stockfish early on. You'll also see some references to stockfish in the 18th century. At one point, we know that it wasn't popular with general people because they actually were trying to encourage the importation of stockfish and stockfish recipes. To help us understand how to use stockfish in a recipe, there's a fascinating entry in Nicholas Creswell's journal. Nicholas Creswell was a young man going from England to North America to seek his fortune, and he's on board ship here in 1774. He says, dined on stockfish and potatoes. This fish is cured in the frost without salt. Before it is boiled, they beat it with iron hammers against the anchor stock to soften it. A general dish on Fridays and is reckoned a great delicacy, but to me it is none, for I hate the smell of it. Poor Nicholas Creswell. But we find out here that they take this stockfish, which you can imagine, how do you cook this into food, and they beat it with hammers to soften it up, and then they boil it. So I was checking a bunch of different references, cooking references in the 18th century with stockfish, and almost every single reference that talks about cooking stockfish mentions the idea of beating it with hammers. Now, modern day cooking with stockfish, they don't beat it with hammers, but that's what we're gonna do. Let's start prepping our fish by beating it with a hammer. So what we're doing is softening this fish up. If we don't soften it up with a hammer, it will take 3 or 4 days of soaking to make this soft enough to actually do something with it. If we beat it with the hammer, it will take much less time.
we might only need to soak it for half a day or just a few hours, or maybe if it's in small enough pieces, we can just toss it right into the boiling water and it'll cook with the potatoes. So let's make a fish stew just like the one that Nicholas Cresswell tried to eat but couldn't eat. Here's our fish. We've already got this beat with our hammer, so it's softened up. The pieces are kind of broken up a little bit. Now, the trick here with this fish is we've got skin on it. We've still got bones inside here, cartilage pieces, all kinds of things we don't want to eat necessarily. And while we could toss this in or try to take out bits of it, it's really hard to separate the bones from the flesh unless we just totally pulverize this thing so that the bones broke down too. Sort of like making fish powder. We could do that and then toss it in here. A better way to do it, if we still want to have nice pieces of fish that we can tell are fish, is we want this to soak. We don't need to soak a whole 4 days like we might need to do it if we hadn't pounded it, but this one I pounded last night and then it's been soaking overnight, and you can see that it's really opened up here and we've got some nice pieces of flesh. So let's open this up and try to get out the bones, and we'll toss it into some nice boiling water and get this cooking up. So we're just going to look through here and find any kind of bones. There really doesn't seem to be a lot that's really popping out. You can definitely feel sometimes the backbone, and that you want to get those pieces out of there because that's never going to soften up. But some of these little bones are very soft. I don't think they're going to cause us a problem after this gets cooked. So that looks really good. One of the most fascinating things when you soak this stockfish is to watch how much it expands. It absorbs water and changes its size to 3 or 4 times as thick. It's just amazing to see what happens when this soaks up water. Now that our fish is boiling up, let's take some potatoes and I'm just going to cube them up and we can slide them right in there to boil along with our fish. Our fish and our potatoes are boiling up, and hey, no naval recipe is complete without some ship's biscuits. Ship's biscuits, how do you preserve bread for months at a time? Well, you make ship's biscuits, and they're very, very dense bread that's baked 3 and 4 times. Very hard, very breakable, and we can break up our ship's biscuits into some little tiny pieces and throw it into our stew to fill it up, get it thicker. It really adds some wonderful flavor too. So I'm going to pound up some ship's biscuits so we can put it in to our stew. I've added some salt and pepper, and we're going to let this boil until those potatoes feel nice and soft, probably about a half an hour. Hopefully, it'll be done about then. Here's our stew, and it actually looks pretty good, and amazingly enough, it does not smell bad at all. So maybe Nicholas Cresswell, he got to smell it before it was cooked, so maybe that was the problem, but once it's cooked, it doesn't smell bad at all. So the question is what does it taste like? Let's get a nice big piece of fish here. Hey, that is surprisingly good. Very nice. The potatoes have kind of grabbed a little bit of that fish flavor, so they taste good. The ship's biscuit in something like this is perfect. If you want to have a little bite left in it, have almost like a little piece of beef. You put it in late so that it doesn't break down too much. If you want it to really sort of fill up and thicken the stew, you want to put it in early, pound it up nice and fine. Either way, it's just so very good. If you really want to, put this right over the top. Just a touch of nutmeg would probably make this perfect. But as it is wonderful. Boy, I am so surprised.
Some days I just want to get away. Life is too complicated. I want to get in my wooden sailboat and sail away. That idea is nothing new. Hundreds of thousands of men in the 18th and early 19th century did exactly that same thing. And while they were able to get away from it all, they found themselves doing a job that was harder than imaginable. Every day I study the 18th and early 19th century. It's my job and I love it. For fun, I dig even deeper into shipboard life of this time period. The memoirs and books by the people who lived in the time period. Samuel Kelly, Spavins, Dana. These books are great and they give us a glimpse of what sailors' life is like in that time period from actual sailors, not from somebody from the outside. If I really want to have fun, and what I do for fun is read and listen to the Patrick O'Brian novels, the Master and Commander series with Aubrey and Matron. You may know the Master and Commander movie. I love it. This common sailor's life is fascinating. What always amazes me is the work that these common sailors have to do. It is probably the most difficult and dangerous job in this time period, and it was done by hundreds of thousands of men. They are working before the age of steam. They've got nothing to propel these ships but sails and ropes. And these ships are very fragile, and they're putting them into the most dangerous circumstances on the earth, dealing with horrible storms, rocks you can't see. It's just incredible that anybody survives at all. And they do this over and over and over again every day of their lives. Sometimes it's the most monotonous thing ever and nothing happens. And then 10 minutes later, they're fighting for their lives, literally. Sometimes after a storm or maybe a battle, or just before you're coming into a port, there are opportunities when the sailor has a chance to have a feast, to have a special meal. They may not have anything different than they've ever had with their typical rations, but they do have an opportunity to combine things they normally wouldn't to make a special meal, to make a feast. That's what we're doing today. So the first dish for our hardworking and hungry sailors is going to be a peas pudding. Now, they're eating peas pudding at least once a week, and sometimes every single day. But their peas pudding, this everyday peas pudding, is just these dried peas boiled in a bag. That's it. That's peas pudding, nothing special. Ours is going to be a little bit more special. We're going to take our peas, we're going to boil them for about a half hour or so. Then we're going to take them out of their bag. We're going to add some butter right into the middle of this clump and a bunch of salt and pepper. And then we're going to close that back up and boil it some more, another half hour or so. And it's going to make this wonderful infused flavor inside of this peas pudding, which is normally a very, very plain dish. They didn't get butter every day. They got butter maybe once a week. So this is special to be able to add pepper and salt and butter into this peas pudding. It's going to give it a great flavor. This dish goes by a couple of different names. Peas pudding, of course, or dog's body, which the sailors more likely would have used. In Samuel Kelly's memoir, as an 18th century sailor, he speaks of peas pudding. He says, "Our daily food from month to month was only beef and peas pudding for dinner and for supper." One of the most important aspects of getting a ship ready for sea is provisioning. You have to have the supplies on board to feed all the men for the trip you're about to take, and probably times two, because you don't know how long your trip might take. Sometimes your average trip might take 3 or 4 weeks, and then another time of year, it might take 4 months. So you have to have lots and lots of provisions on board. What are the provisions? You're going to have salt meat, so salt beef, and salt pork. You're going to have lots and lots of sea bread, or ship's biscuit. We know it today as hardtack. You'll even have a special room on board the ship, tin lined, so that the rats can't get in, that you store all this bread in. It's got to stay dry. We also have other kinds of provisions. Oatmeal, dried peas. We're going to have butter and cheese. So the dish I'm most excited about here is the main dish, lobscouse. It's got a fun name to it. It's one of those names that nobody's quite sure where it comes from, but it is classic lobscouse from the 18th century. The main component here in lobscouse is something like salt pork, which the sailors are eating a couple of days out of every single week. We're going to take some onion, again, kind of a special treat for sailors, and we're going to take that onion and brown it a little bit in a frying pan. I'm going to toss in potatoes. Again, a special treat for a sailor. We're going to put in some diced up potato into these onions. Once it's cooked up, can go into our pot. A pot of water with some chopped up salt pork in it. If we're using salt pork, we want to start off with the water cold. If we were making our lobscouse with fresh pork, well, we'd put those pork pieces in with those onions and brown them, toss them into the hot water already boiling. We're going to let those boil a half hour or so, maybe a little bit longer, and then comes the extra special part of lobscouse. And that is ship's biscuits. Ship's biscuits are the thing that sailors get each and every day. Almost a pound of ship's biscuits each and every day. And ship's biscuits are almost inedible in the state that you would get them. These are just flour and salt, a little bit of water. You knead them up into these hard little biscuit shapes, and they get baked at a very low temperature for a very long time. You're driving out all the moisture. They last a long time. They do go bad, and bugs and weevils find their way into them, but the sailor's going to eat them anyway. The ship's biscuit is going to thicken and add texture to our lobscouse. Right now it's just a soup, but this will go in and give it a real stew texture. The small parts just thicken it. The bigger parts will stay nice and chunky. They'll add to it. They'll make it seem like we have twice as much meat as what's really in here. We find lobscouse showing up in dictionaries and literary works in the 18th and 19th century. And we never find it in a cookbook. You're not going to find it there because sailors aren't writing down their recipes. But the dictionary reference here in the Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue from 1788 gives us a quick snapshot. What is lobscouse? It says, a dish much eaten at sea, composed of salt beef, biscuit and onions, well peppered and stewed together. These two main dishes are ready, the dog's body, peas pudding, and the lobscouse. And let's give this just a little try. This is not something I eat every day, that's for sure. But you can tell this one's special with that buttery flavor and the salt and pepper infused in it. This is what I really want to make sure to test. This is the lobscouse. Oh, that's so good. This is going to be completely different than what a sailor gets each and every day. A different texture. It's got a different mixture of things all put together, cooked in a way that you don't get every day. This is really, really good. We've got our vegetables. We have our meat, our protein, but we need dessert. We need to set this off. So we're going to make the sailor's delight. They called it plum duff. It is a boiled pudding made with flour, sometimes with suet or with slush from the ship's galley, and the sweetness, raisins. They would have pounds and pounds of raisins just for this dish. There are truly some harrowing stories from this time period written by the sailors themselves. In Dana's 2 years before the mast, he talks about coming around Cape Horn and just how incredibly difficult it was, having to run up on deck in the middle of the night. You don't know exactly when. you haven't slept more than 4 hours no matter what. The decks are icy. You have to climb icy rope ladders 100 feet above the deck and bring in a sail that's as hard as a board because it's frozen solid. Again, without a single light to see by in the middle of the night. And then you have to come down on deck. And is there anything to eat? Well, if the weather's been really bad, you can't light the galley fires. So there's no warm food. I can't even imagine it. For a meal, we have to have a drink. What did the sailors want? They wanted grog. In home waters, they got a gallon of beer a day, but that wasn't what they really wanted. Once they were out of home waters, they got grog, which was rum mixed with water, 3-to-1. That's the drink they wanted. It's the drink we're gonna have for our feast. These men were not well paid. They were drawn from the lower classes, and yet they were asked to do an impossible job, probably the most dangerous and difficult job of the time period. And without them, we would have no 13 colonies. We wouldn't have overseas commerce in any shape or form. The world would look completely different and much, much poorer. This is a wonderful feast. Our sailors are going to love this. It makes me want to buy a ship. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. Today's recipe is called a sea pie. You might think a sea pie would be full of seafood, but you would be wrong. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So the recipe today is called a sea pie. Okay, if a sea pie doesn't have seafood in it, why are we gonna call it a sea pie? Well, it's a pie that's made at sea. It's a pie that's made on board ship. It's not for the sailors per se, but for the officers on board ship. Sailors are just gonna have, kind of real plain food. But this is fancy. This is a fancy dish for the officers on board. Here's the trick. How do we bake a pie at sea? That's the problem because ships in the 18th century do not have ovens. So it gets very difficult. I mean, I don't know how do you bake a pie in your 18th century ship when you don't have an oven? Well, you don't bake it. You boil your pie. So we're gonna be making a boiled pie. I've never done a boiled pie. This ought to be a lot of fun. We don't find, say, a cookbook all full of sailor recipes, but we do find them showing up in cookbooks now and then. Surprisingly, a sea pie shows up in Amelia Simmons's First American Cookbook from 1797. It says, a sea pie, 4 pounds of flour, 1.5 pounds of butter rolled into a paste, wet with cold water. Basic, plain old pie crust here. Line the pot therewith. So we're gonna line up a pot or a deep dish with pie crust. Then it says, lay in split pigeons, turkey pies, veal, mutton or birds with slices of pork, salt and pepper, dust on flour, doing thus till the pot is full with your ingredients expended. Add 3 pints of water, cover tight with paste, and stew moderately 2.5 hours. Now, this takes some interpretation, just like every recipe does in the 18th century, and luckily there are some other recipes sort of show up and help interpret what's going on with this one. It says stew for 2.5 hours. It does mean boiled. Many times we need a deep dish, a deep pan, because we're doing layers of meat, and generally we have paste in between. So it'll be, we have this whole lined dish, and then we have one kind of meat, and then a layer of paste, and another kind of meat, and a layer of paste, till we get to the very top. We put another layer of paste on the top, and then some of the recipes talking about taking a plate, putting it over the top of that, tying it down tight, and then boiling that whole thing. This is a typical sort of 3-to-1 sort of pie crust. So we have 3 times by weight the amount of flour. Then we do have butter, and we rub this butter in. We want to start off with nice cold butter on this kind of pie crust. And I'm just rubbing it into the flour. Trying not to get it too warm. It's nice and cold in here, so that's not really a big problem. Mix it in so it's you don't have big butter lumps in there. So I cut the butter up into little pieces first. And then when it's mixed in there good enough, then we add cold water. Cold water enough to bring it all together into a paste. If you're doing 18th century cooking, you're going to be making a lot of pie crusts, and you might as well get good at it. And they talked about a lot of different kinds of pie crusts in that time period. We're used to just, there's just one kind of pie crust. They had hot oil pie crusts, and you'll find a recipe book. Even Amelia Simmons, I think there are 3, 4, 5 different sorts of pie crust recipes in there. They're all pretty similar, but don't be afraid of pie crusts. They don't have to be perfect. And this kind of recipe, well, you're going to be boiling it, so it's not going to be light and fluffy anyway. So have fun with pie crusts. They're not that difficult to do. We're gonna roll this out, I don't know, not too thin. I kind of want it to be thick in there, but there's plenty here for the dish that we're gonna be using. Something happened when I was prepping for this episode, and it doesn't happen very often. In fact, it's never happened to me before, but I was baking or boiling one of these last night. Took all the time to make it exactly like we're doing it here, even boiling it in the same sort of pot and everything. It boiled for an hour and a half. It was great. I took it out. It was hot. It was toward time to go to bed. I thought, I'll just set this on our back porch where it will cool off, and I'll check it out in the morning, and then I'll know exactly how it's going to turn out for this episode. This morning I got up, I went out to the back porch to find this, to see how it turned out, and I was like, well, it's not there. And I thought for sure, I put it on the back porch. Maybe I took it out to the German kitchen set here because I needed someplace cool for it. I couldn't find it any place. I looked all over. And finally I put on a set of shoes and I walked out into the woods, and there I found the dish, the plate, everything empty, completely empty, every bit gone. Every molecule of my sea pie, my test sea pie, was gone. Apparently raccoons thought that the sea pie was for them, and so I don't know how this is going to turn out because my test one is gone. We're going to assemble this pie in a deep dish. Can't be in a flat pie pan. We need a nice deep pie pan. We have multiple layers. And we're going to be simplifying this recipe. We're making a smaller version, and we're simplifying it with the kinds of meat here. Really, it seems like almost whatever meat you've got will work in this pie, but you make these layers of different kinds of meat. So you have a variety. This one, we just have ham and chicken thighs that we've taken the bones out of. So we just have a layer of ham, and then a layer of chicken, then a layer of ham, and between each layer, we're gonna be putting a layer of the paste. Once this is all put together, we're gonna put a plate on top so it holds it nice and firm, and protects it from water. And then we're gonna tie this up so that that plate doesn't come off. So here it is. Here is our sea pie. I've cut it open and it does things that I didn't expect it to. I've been reading about sea pies for years in the Aubrey and Maturin series. There's like 21 books, Napoleon era, seafaring stories, just great books. I can't recommend them enough as historical fiction. It smells really, really good. And the pie dough crust did some, it's not too different than a standard pie crust. So it smells really good. Let's see if we can get some out of here for us. And here's a section. This has a little bit of the chicken, a little bit of the ham, and some of the paste. I love what the texture of the pie dough has done in here. It does some really, really interesting, fun texture things, which, we're not kind of used to. That ham, of course, works really, really well with the chicken, and then we have the salt and pepper. We have got all these stacked layers, decks on board a ship, like we would have what they talk about on a sea pie. Boy, this is fun. I'm gonna have to try this much more often. You can see why it shows up even in a cookbook like American Cookery, where not everyone in the 18th century has an oven, but everyone in the 18th century has something they can boil this in. That's the most typical sort of cookery that's going on. And if you have anything in your kitchen to work with, you've got something you can boil even just a little sea pie in, and we can put whatever we want in it. They always have lots of different kinds of meats, and we could probably experiment and put we could put greens in here if we really wanted to. We could do, whatever we have sort of left over or whatever's in season. This is good. When I say the word grog, you're probably thinking about pirates or maybe sailors in the 18th century. And grog is a fascinating topic. It is a drink that the sailors drank on board ship while they were at sea, generally far away from their home ports. This is a really fascinating topic when we dig into the provisions that sailors had in the 18th century. Most of the sailors in the 18th century, their provisions were based on what was given to the sailors in the Royal Navy, because that was the biggest navy of the time period and the one that was probably most important. And so civilian ships and even ships like in the later United States Navy were based on the concepts that happened there in the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy had very particular regulations about how they were going to feed and how they were going to clothe their sailors. And feeding them was very difficult. Men might be at sea for 6 months or a year. And so feeding them was extremely important. And what were they going to drink when they were on board ship? Even water is very difficult to come by in the 18th century. Good, clean drinking water. People are drinking standard surface water, water out of the rivers, water out of the lakes. This isn't purified in any way, and in a lot of circumstances, it was just plain unhealthy to drink in any way. And so things like beer and other beverages are important for the standard public health of people. So most people drank some kind of very weak or just normal kind of a beer or a wine just because it was the safest thing to drink. On any particular ship, they're going to have a lot of regular drinking water put on board right at the beginning. But the problem is the water is put into standard wooden barrels that they use over and over again. They're very easily contaminated and very difficult to clean out. And they didn't even know kind of the best way to clean them out in the time period. And so they would put thousands of gallons of water on board of a ship, but within a week or two, it starts to grow things like algae or bacteria inside of those barrels. So that water is not only unpalatable, but downright unhealthy to drink. If the water is unhealthy to drink, then we have to give those sailors something else to drink. And standard beer was that drink, especially when you were fairly close to home. A typical sailor's ration of the time period might be something like a pound of salt beef and a pound of ship's biscuit, plus 1 gallon of beer a day. That was the typical kind of ration. The beer that they were typically serving in that middle of the 18th century context, it did not have very many hops in it. And so it would go bad, especially in the high temperatures that you might see in places that you're sailing to, say the West Indies. That beer might be good for 3 or 4 weeks, but you're going to run out of beer, especially at a gallon a man per day. So a small frigate might have 200 men on board, 200 gallons a day. 10 days, 2,000 gallons. 100 days, 20,000 gallons. How are you going to have that much beer on board? It's just not possible, and it's going to get spoiled. So the Navy needed another solution, especially for sailors that were going far abroad. If you're going overseas, you're going to be spending anything like 2 or 3 months away. You're going to need something more than just regular beer. And so they came up with the idea of using local alcoholic beverages for wherever they're at. If the sailors were, say, in the Mediterranean, they might be served wine instead of their beer. But in other places, wine wasn't available, beer might not be available, and so they went to other kinds of more spirituous liquors. Right there at the beginning of the 18th century, Great Britain gets a toehold into the West Indies and really starts to expand in that area. And the classic drink in the West Indies was rum. They had a lot of rum because of the molasses. Sugar was the cash crop of that area, and molasses was a byproduct. It was what was left over after you made your sugar. You would take this molasses, you would distill it, and you would have this very rough textured rum that was left over. The Navy would buy this rum, which would never go bad really if you keep it in small barrels, and they would serve that out to their sailors instead of their beer ration. So instead of a gallon of beer, you got basically a cup, a full, say, 8 ounces of rum per day. You would get that split into 2 rations, so a half of that cup in the morning, a half later on in the day. There was a big problem in that sailors would keep that ration back, maybe for 2 or 3 days, and then they would get roaring drunk, and it would be a major problem on board ship. So the Navy had to come up with a solution to that, and there was the Vice Admiral Vernon. And he was a man who didn't think that the sailors should probably have any rum ration at all, that alcoholic beverages weren't really a good thing on board ship, but he had to come up with some way to fix that. And in 1740, he came up with orders to basically dilute their rum ration. So take that rum ration and add in 4 times as much water. They will have then this diluted mixture. It will make the water safe, and they won't get nearly as drunk, and so we will have solved our problem. The sailors didn't think this was necessarily a very good idea, and so they gave that drink a special name. They named it after the admiral. They didn't call it Vernon, but they named it after the kind of cloak that the admiral wore. He was apparently a cheapskate. And he wore a special boat cloak, or his standard boat cloak, instead of what the sailors thought this vice admiral should wear, which would be fancy gold lace. Instead, he wore one out of very, very inexpensive fabric, a fabric called Grog. It had these kind of ribs, and it was just basically the cheapest heavy fabric available. So they called this new drink Grog. If we dig into Admiral Vernon's direct orders here that create Grog, there's some really interesting stuff. It starts off with the classic order of the 18th century, whereas it manifestly appears to be the unanimous opinions of both captains and surgeons that the pernicious custom of the seamen drinking their allowance of rum in drams, and often at once, is attended with many fatal effects to their morals as well as to their health. He goes on to make sure that the sailors do get their proper ration, and that it is the full ration, because he knows it's quite common for sailors to get defrauded in this time period, generally by the purser. So there is a special barrel set aside on deck. There is always an officer there to watch that the exact amounts get measured, the proper amount of rum and the proper amount of water, and then it gets divvied out to the sailors so that they get exactly their proper ration. There's another part to this Grog story, and it has to do with scurvy. Now, scurvy is one of the worst kind of diseases for sailors in this time period. It is a deficiency in vitamin C. When you're at sea and you're eating a very, very restricted diet for 2 or 3 or 4 months, your body will finally run out of vitamin C, and it will start to literally fall apart. Your hair will come out, your teeth will come out, you will get this black legs, and it is just a horrific disease to go through. And many, many sailors died of scurvy in the 18th century. Coming up with a solution for scurvy was something people were trying to figure out for a long time. A lot of doctors were working on this. Dr. Lind was working on this problem. He was a naval surgeon in the middle of the 18th century. He wrote a whole treatise on scurvy, and he was pointing to a couple possible solutions. And one of those was lime juice and lemon juice. He didn't actually say that was the perfect solution. He said it was one of the possible solutions, but most of the other ones that he pointed out wouldn't actually work. The British Navy finally figured this out about 45 years later. In 1795, they actually mandated a lime juice or a lemon juice ration for their sailors to fight off this concept of scurvy. Unfortunately, many times the lime juice or lemon juice would have been boiled, destroying the vitamin C that was in it. That's too bad. Regardless, this lime juice and lemon juice gets added to the sailors' rations, and it gets connected with grog. The lime juice or the lemon juice goes into the grog, probably because they wanted to make sure those sailors took that ration, and the only way they could make sure was to put it in the grog that they knew the sailors wouldn't miss. This is from 1724. This is John Knott's Cooks and Confectioners Dictionaries. So about 15 years before Vernon made his order about grog. Here is a punch for chambermaids. Take a quart of water, a quarter of a pint of lime juice. Squeeze in also the juice of a Seville orange and a lemon. Put in 6 ounces of fine sugar. Strain it all through a strainer 3 times till it is very clear, then put in a pint of brandy and a half a pint of white wine. So we've got water, we've got lime, lemon, and orange juice, we've got a little brandy, a little wine, but essentially it's a mixture like brandy and some water along with sugar and along with citrus fruit. This is normal kind of a punch in the time period. Grog is this simplified and no sugar and no citrus. So let's make some grog exactly like Admiral Vernon ordered. We've got 2 different recipes here, or let's say a recipe and additions that he suggests. We've got water, we've got rum, and the suggestion of the addition that if the sailors saved their money, they could add lime and they could add sugar. Remember that on board ship, they would do this in large quantities. They would do it for, say, half of the sailors at a time. So they would have a large barrel, the head would be knocked out of it. It was the barrel made for mixing this stuff we're just gonna make a very small quantity, one single ration of it. So I've got the ration here, we've got rum, and this ration would be split twice a day. He gives it for the whole day, but it would be split in half. So we have a half a cup of rum, and we have 2 cups of water. And we are gonna mix these two together, and that will give us a 4-to-1 mixture of rum to water. Here's our 4-to-1 mixture. We can give this a quick try. It is watered down rum. It really isn't, it doesn't taste very strong at all. It's just got kind of a rum hint to it. So you can really see why the sailors wanted to make fun of this drink. They came up with a disparaging term for it. We're making fun of this cheapskate admiral, basically. So, you know, you can definitely tell, I mean, I wouldn't want to have to drink this full tumbler and, you know, go up on top of a mast, but it definitely does take the bite out of this, and it keeps me from, you know, secreting back my rum ration 3 or 4 days, collecting it together, and then just having it all at once and really causing a bunch of havoc on board ship. Now, right here in the order, Vernon does say that the sailors should save their money and add something to this to make it more palatable, to make it more fun. So we have his suggestion here. We've got a lime. We're gonna take it, we're gonna cut it up into a couple of little slices here, and we will add a little bit of lime juice to it. And he does say lime, even though lemons are one of the possible additions. And then we've got some of our sugar. We don't need to add a ton here. I wonder if the sailors ever got a chance to have it like his suggestion, but we will at least get a chance to try it like that. And yes, much better. It does not take a lot to move the needle on a drink like this, where plain watered down rum, add a little bit of sugar, add a little bit of lime to it, and it certainly makes it a much more palatable drink. So what do you do with a drunken sailor? Well, if you take Admiral Vernon's advice, you take his rum and you water it down so he doesn't get drunk. Imagine you have a barrel full of salt pork. How will you prepare it? In today's episode, we'll be doing a Cheshire Pork Pie for the sea. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. If you haven't seen our recent salt pork episode, make sure to go back and watch that. It sets the stage for this episode. Now, this recipe is called a Cheshire Pork Pie for the Sea. It's from The Art of Cookery. This is Hannah Glass's cookbook. It is the most popular English cookbook of the 18th century. So it's very, very common that people would recognize this and know this in our time period. Now, here's the recipe as it's written. Take some salt pork that has been boiled, cut it into thin slices, and an equal quantity of potatoes pared and sliced thin. Make a good crust, cover the dish, lay a layer of meat, seasoned with a little pepper, a layer of potatoes, and a layer of meat, and a layer of potatoes, so on until your pie is full. Season it with pepper. When it is full, lay some butter on the top. Fill your dish about half full of soft water, close your pie up, and bake it in a gentle oven. Seems pretty simple. It is a very simple pie with just meat, potatoes, a little bit of spices, tiny bit of butter and water, seal it up, and you bake it. And you're probably thinking, okay, now why is this a pie for the sea, right? And that's part of the story about them using salt pork here. Salt pork is a way to preserve pork. It's the kind of thing that if you didn't have anything fresh, maybe you're all the way in the spring, you need food, you're going to have salt pork stored back. If you're at sea, salt pork is one of the few meats you'll have available to you all the time. Salt beef, salt pork. So that's why they're talking about it being at sea. This is the kind of food that sailors, even the officers on board ship, are going to have to use this at times. Now, we might think of this as a kind of a rich pie with lots of meat in it. It's probably actually a very inexpensive pie for the time period. So even poor people would be able to make a pie like this because it's salt pork, because it's potatoes, and basically nothing else. Here's the problem, and kind of a interesting take on this particular recipe, that sailors on board a ship, they were just given boiled salt pork. They just got this kind of boiled pork on a plate, and good luck with that. If an officer on board ship, if their supplies had run out, the kind that they brought on board for themselves, livestock and whatnot, when all those things ran out, it was time to use the regular provisions that just regular sailors would have, but they wouldn't want to eat it like the other sailors would have it. So the captain on board ship would say, well, fix up that salt pork, but make sure it doesn't look like just common salt pork. So they would cook it up into a pie like this. So this might very well show up on the captain's table for him to eat, maybe with his guests. The same fare as anybody else is getting, but made in a kind of a special way. So this is a great fun recipe and a great way to use salt pork rather than just boiling it. Let's start to prepare this recipe, and we're gonna do it in the order that she kind of calls for it. We've got boiled salt pork here, and this salt pork, the boiling process is very, very simple. There are directions for boiling salt pork in Hannah Glass, so you can follow those directions, but really the trick with any salt meat like this is you put it into the water when the water's cold and you bring it up to boiling. For fresh meat, you put it in the boiling water. But this has been boiled about 45 minutes or so. The pieces aren't too big. And we're just gonna cut it into our thin slices. Now I do wanna check to see whether or not it's too salty. And boy, it's gonna be good. It's not too salty. So you may not have a giant full barrel of salt pork, but you still want to experience this recipe. And that situation happened in the 18th century. And so they had a sort of a speed method for salt preparation. If you want to have salt pork, use it for a recipe like this, but you don't have salt pork, all you have to do is take your pork pieces and put them in salt, dry salt, for maybe 24 hours or so ahead of time, and then wipe that salt off and you can use it. It's going to give you almost exactly the same sort of flavor. It's going to be not quite as tough as salt pork would be because the salt pulls all the moisture out. Even when it's like submerged, it still pulls all the moisture out, makes the meat a little firmer, but it definitely gives it a little bit different flavor also. So there were situations in the 18th century where they had recipes. It's like, oh, you want to make a quick salt pork? Well, this is how you do it. The meat has been pre-cooked, but the potatoes are not. I've already peeled these up with my knife. I am gonna make sure these are thin slices so that they cook all the way through in the pie. She calls for a good pie crust. So we're making up just the standard short paste with flour, butter, tiny bit of salt, the flour and the butter in a 3-to-1 ratio. Very, very simple and easy to do pie crust. Something you should definitely do at home. Don't buy your pie crusts. You need to make them. Our pie is all assembled. It's ready to go into the oven, and she calls for it to be baked in a gentle oven. So this is likely about 350 degrees. Now we're going to be using our giant clay oven for this, and it's a little bit trickier. So I'm going to aim for about 400 degrees, put it in there, probably bake it, I don't know, I'm guessing 45 minutes, and the temperature will slowly go down. If you're doing it in a regular home oven, yeah, 350 degrees should sound good, and well, we'll just see how long it takes. So let's get it in the oven. Wow, this pie smells great. And it came out of the oven, it looks good. And I cut into this and the steam came out and everything, and just, I can't wait. I cannot wait to try this out. It looks so good. Let's try a piece of the pork all by itself. Turned out perfect. I was worried it was going to be too salty because it's salt pork. There's a real reason why we have all these potatoes in here. That dilutes the saltiness out of this so that it's not, kind of too salty. And really, it turned out just right. And all that pepper in there, again, balances it. Now, the original recipe may have had all that pepper in there to sort of offset maybe bad salt pork that has been in the barrel too long. But in this case, it's really good. Love that peppery flavor in there. We didn't need to add any salt. And it doesn't need any other spices. I mean, you could go crazy and add nutmeg to this, but you don't need to. It's really good just like this. And so incredibly simple. I mean, it's just got the salt pork, it's got the, the potatoes, a little bit of butter, and the pie crust, and it's a great combination. So I'm really liking how this one turned out. It's gonna be one of my favorites, definitely, for this year. It's great to think about a recipe like this. It seems in the cookbook that it's so simple. There's really nothing to it. But when you understand the connections, the connection between the idea of using the salt pork and it being a Cheshire pork pie for the sea, and the reasons why you would do this, now it starts to make all kinds of sense. In context, it's a very important recipe. So I really like this one and suggest it to a lot of different people. And of course, it's in Hannah Glass's cookbook. So if you're interested in that, you can check out our website. We sell that cookbook, and it is one of the best for understanding what's going on with English cookery of the 18th century. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and I'm excited about today's episode. We'll be doing a Caribbean-inspired recipe right from the 18th century, Pepperpot. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. This recipe comes from The Lady's Assistant, Charlotte Mason, 1777. This is an English cookbook, but it has this obviously Caribbean-inspired pepperpot recipe. To make pepperpot, to 3 quarts of water, put in a small cabbage, 2 large handfuls of spinach, a head of lettuce, 2 or 3 onions, a little thyme. Cut them very small and let them stew. With 2 pounds of mutton till they are quite tender. Boil with them some little dumplings made of flour and water, and a piece of pork, a little salted. A half an hour before it's taken up, put in a lobster or a crab, picked very small and clean from the shell, with a little salt and cayenne pepper. So this pepperpot is really a take on a 18th century pepperpot made in the West Indies and then sort of translated
into the English context. You can imagine that Charlotte Mason, the author of this particular cookbook, she didn't go to the West Indies and watch pepper pot being made, and she probably never ate a West Indian pepper pot. But someone came from the West Indies and explained this dish and maybe made it so that she had a chance to sort of interpret it. So we have an interpretation, an 18th century interpretation of an 18th century pepper pot. Probably nothing like a pepper pot is made today, but we're gonna make this recipe. We are gonna tweak it a little bit. It seems like she's very light on the pepper of the pepper pot, so we'll play with that a little bit. First off though, we've got a lot of greens here. I've got some spinach, we've got a cabbage that we're gonna cut up a little bit. We've got collard greens and a little bit of lettuce. We're gonna chop those up nice and small and get them going in our pot right away.
Let's add 2 onions diced up nice and fine to add into our greens.
So the meat portion of this that we're going to put in today is pork. It's fresh pork. The recipe called for mutton. It was probably an inexpensive cut for the time period. She also calls for a little bit of salt pork. We've got an opportunity here to put in whatever we please here. You could put in some beef, like stew beef, something similar to that. Right here, I've got some pork already diced up into nice smaller pieces. That looks good. It's boiling up. We might leave that boil for half an hour or so, but right now we're gonna work on our hard dumplings. That's the next part of this recipe. She doesn't say exactly when to toss these in, so we're gonna make them up right now. We'll probably let that boil for an hour, 45 minutes, and then we'll toss these in and let them cook for a little bit. But let's make them up now. Super simple. I've got flour here, and I'm just gonna toss in a good bit of flour. I don't know, maybe I have 12 ounces of flour. I'm gonna add just a touch of salt to that. That looks good. And now water, and I'm gonna make this up into a hard paste. It's just flour, salt, water. Add enough. Okay, it's a nice stiff paste. That's what we're looking for. We're just gonna tear it off into, say, walnut-sized little balls. Roll those up like that. There are hard dumplings. We're gonna make sure they're all sealed up. Sometimes they don't have quite, we wanna have a consistency so it all locks together and doesn't wanna fall apart at all, right? That's our dumpling. These are so simple and they show up in a lot of these kinds of soups and stews. If you want some other kind of filler in there, really, really common. This looks really good. It's been slow boiling about an hour, hour and a half. The meat is wonderful and tender. The other things haven't broken down too much, so I don't want to let it cook too long. Next up, in the recipe, it says a half hour before serving or half hour before you take it up, you're supposed to put in either some lobster or some crab meat. And it says that it should be all picked, you know, fine. We don't want any shell, we don't want any big chunks. This should be a fine crab meat here. And remember, in the time period that lobster and crab were probably fairly inexpensive meats here. So this isn't necessarily a super fancy way to fix it up, at least in the 18th century. It might be today. So let me put the crab meat in. And now we get to the namesake of a pepper pot. Let's talk about the pepper. This isn't black pepper or white pepper that's being used in this. It's cayenne pepper, sometimes called Guinea pepper because it came from the Guinea coast of South America. That's what we're gonna put into this. We've got a little bit of salt as it calls for, and then it says cayenne pepper. Does it mean a little bit of cayenne pepper or does it mean a lot? Well, that's up to you, isn't it? Let me tell you, this smells great. And I don't know if I've had anything quite like this. Can't wait to try this out. Lots of greens in here, lots of greens. And it's got pork, and it's got crab meat, and it's got the dumplings. So there's a lot of stuff going on in here. Let me find a little bit of the crab meat. There we go. Yes, yes. And I think I put in just the right amount of cayenne. Definitely a pepper pot, not just a, a stew. We've got more things to try out. The greens, we want some other textures in there. We have the dumpling. A little bit of pork. This is great. It may not be exactly like a pepper pot that you know, but it is so good. This really, really interesting 18th century English interpretation of a pepper pot.
When I say salt beef, you probably think sailors, maybe pirates, maybe soldiers. But the reality of salt beef is that it would be common to everyone in the 18th century. Food preservation is so important to everyone's life every day. Doesn't matter whether it's 250 years ago or today. Salting was probably the most common food preservation technique, and yet we hardly use it today ever. We do have some preserved salted meats today in the grocery store. We just might not recognize them for what they are. They call it dried beef. But this is salted beef. It's dried in little slices and it's available to us. It is a version of salt beef in the time period. They've just made it in a way that we can use it easily. Very, very salty. You can also get other kinds of salted sausages. They're partially cured, but part of what's going on there is just the salt preservation in there. But in the 18th century, their salt provisions were just salt. That's it. They would preserve these big, giant chunks of meat in tons and tons of salt. And this was a technique that was used for literally thousands of years. Now, what's really going on when we salt beef? How can we take a piece of meat like this that at room temperature would go bad in a very short period of time and make it last for months, if not years, at room temperature? The real thing that's going on here is that when we pack salt around a piece of meat like this, what it does is it starts to pull the water components out of the meat. And water is really what's happening with bacterial action. If we can reduce the water content of any kind of food to as close to zero as we can get, then the bacterial activity goes way, way down. And while it may continue to decay in some ways, it's not going to go bad in the same kind of way. We can freeze dry meat and it'll last for a while. It's not gonna last forever and ever, especially if it's got oxygen. But if we can take salt and it starts to pull the water out of the meat, it also puts salt into the meat, and that sodium chloride, it kind of keeps some or most kinds of bacteria from growing, so that slows it down also. And after we repack our salt beef, we fill up the keg with a brine solution. We're also restricting oxygen. So it's kind of a triple whammy. We're really doing many different things to the meat to keep it from going bad. The interesting thing is we understand the science of this today, but in the 18th century and the hundreds of years before that, they had no idea exactly what was going on. They just knew it worked. Now, this salting technique was used for more than beef. It was used for salt pork and other items, especially salt fish. They would even salt vegetables at times. So the real question is, how is salt pork and salt beef different from each other? And we've talked about salt pork a lot on the channel, done a couple of episodes on it. And salt pork was the one that was probably in more demand. When you salted pork, it tended to work a little better. It was softer when it came out. It was probably a little easier and more tasty when you cooked it up. There were even circumstances where Joseph Paul Martin talked about the soldiers in very dire circumstances eating their salt pork raw. Now, I can't imagine that. I'm sure it wasn't very good like that. But salt beef, it would have been harder to do that. Salt beef generally gets harder as a meat. It can be very difficult to work with, and you have to soak it for a long time and boil it for a long time before it really becomes very edible. So if they ate tons and tons, probably millions of tons in the 18th century of salt beef and salt pork also, how did they cook it? What did they use it for? That's a really good question, and it's hard to answer. If you open up the 18th century cookbooks of the time period, there are, in reality, very few recipes that mention it specifically. Probably because it was usually cooked in one way, and that is they just boiled it. They just boiled it a lot. They might have put other things in with it to make a kind of a soup, so they might have put vegetables or something like barley in with it, but most of the time it was probably just boiled and served. There really isn't a whole lot of direction there. Although, if we look in the most popular cookbook of the 18th century, in Hannah Glass, she talks about dealing with salted meats, in the boiling section, obviously. And she says, if you're going to be boiling salt meat versus fresh meat, then you want to put it into cold water and allow it to come up to the boiling temperature, rather than take your meat and just toss it into the boiling water, which you would do with fresh meat. And the reason for that, found in a different cookbook, was that, as the author said, the salt would strike into the meat. It would make it saltier. It would force the salt back into the meat versus kind of releasing the salt. So if it just came up from a cold temperature, more of the salt would go back into the water. And another issue with salt meat was you had to soak it before you tried to cook with it. You had to first brush off all this salt, and then you would put it in baths of water for at least 12 hours and more likely 24 hours. So it took a lot of extra prep time. And if you're on board a ship where fresh water is hard to come by, they would soak it in salt water first. The salt water isn't as salty as the salted meat, so some of that salt would go away. They might even take a sort of a cage of metal or just hooks and put a big hook in the piece of salt beef and throw it overboard and drag it in the water like it was a piece of bait or something. And that would sort of keep washing the salt away. The problem is, of course, something might try to come up and eat your piece of salt beef, and it was difficult to have lots of pieces of meat trailing behind a ship. And when you're feeding sailors, you might be feeding 200 men or many more than that. So you have to deal with a lot of pieces of salt beef every day. I wanted to find a couple of references specifically to salt beef and how it was delivered, how they got it, especially in the military. And here's a letter from George Washington, and it's part of his orders. And he says, "You are to bespeak," in other words, to order, "all the pork and flour you can from the inhabitants upon the river Kennebec. A commissary will be immediately sent from the commissary general to agree and to pay for the same. You will also acquaint the inhabitants that the commissary will have orders to purchase 60 barrels of salted beef of 225 pounds each per barrel." Those are big barrels of salt beef. So let's make some salt beef like the directions from the 18th century. I'm not going to show every one of these steps because some of them I can't show easily because it takes a long period of time to do salt beef. But we can at least do some of these early stages and talk about what's going on. So salt beef. The meat would be cut up into 3 or 4 pound chunks. And like the meat I've got here is a 3.5 pound piece. This would be a normal size of piece of meat that they would use in the time period. They would then take this and put it into a salting vessel. Sometimes it might be a keg. If you were salting a smaller quantity of meat, you would use a salting tub. The idea of having a salting tub is normal for households. They're going to be salting meat all the time. And so they would have this large quantity of salt that was ready to go in a vessel so that you could start salting meat. So this meat would cool off, and then you would rub salt all over the top of it. Interestingly, in the time period, sometimes they called it powdered meat or powdering the meat because the salt they used, they would grind down into a smaller powder. So we want salt that gets into all the crevices. So we might powder it with salt and then put it into a larger vessel of salt around it. Now it's going to start pulling the moisture out immediately. And you would leave this for 10 to 12 days, maybe 2 weeks in this kind of a state. You might have a barrel that had these pieces of meat in their salt just waiting. But if you wanted this meat to last for months or years, then you would take the meat back out of this salting vessel. You would brush off all the salt. You would smell it. Is this piece still good? Is it bad? You would set aside the bad pieces, you would throw it out, or whatever you would do with that. Then the meat gets repacked into the barrel with fresh salt. After your meat has been repacked in the barrel, packed tightly with salt between each piece, then you would pour a brine solution. You want this to be a very briny solution, something that had so much salt in it that an egg would float. Then the head of the keg would be put on. You want to make sure that there was no air, at least as little air as you could possibly do it. And so this meat would be actually sitting in all that salt and in that brine solution. All the air bubbles are gone, it's nothing but salt, and we have nothing but good pieces of meat. When it's time to use your salt beef, it comes out of the keg, we wash the salt off of it, and we soak it in regular water. You can see these pieces that are just out of the salt. They are pretty tough. Now this has only been salting for about 10 or 12 days, so it hasn't really gotten to its normal, very, very hard state. In the 18th century, if you took that beef out of the keg and maybe it's been in there a year, sometimes longer than that, this meat would be very hard. Hard enough that it would be like wood. And in some cases, they would carve it like it was wood. It looked like mahogany, kind of brown and stiff. But when we want to use it, we're gonna soak it in water. If we get a chance to change the water a couple of times, it's gonna be better. Soak it 24 hours, and it starts to look even worse than this. This does not look appetizing, but after we soak it, it really looks bad. These pieces of meat have been soaking for about a day, and they don't look as good as this. They kind of turn gray, but at least they're a lot more flexible and hopefully more edible. Most people in the time period, again, would just boil this. You could, there are some recipes for using it in a boiled pudding. We would take this meat, we would cut it up into smaller pieces, put it inside of a pudding paste, or we could even use these pieces inside of something like a sea pie, which we've done on the channel before, where we take a pie and we put pieces like this in and either bake it or boil it. And this, again, is a way of cooking it at a very low temperature. If we took this kind of meat and we put it on the grill or cooked it in some other way, like fried it in a pan, it would be very hard, very dry, and very salty. So all the different ways that they normally cook it in the 18th century were basically boiling it, or in the case of a boiled pie, we're just cooking it at 212 degrees. So again, a very, very gentle cooking method for a meat like this. I took some of the salt beef that had been soaking for 24 hours, cut it up into some smaller pieces, and lightly boiled it for more than an hour to have our example pieces here. And I didn't do anything else with it. Really, in most of these recipes, that's it. They just boiled it. And so we're gonna try it out just like that to get an idea about what it tastes like, what its texture is like. This did not stand in the salt for a year. Okay, this is just a a short salting time period, which they did. But let's find out just what it tastes like. Actually, this is not over salty, which I was really afraid of, and its texture is not that bad. So for a gentle boil for an hour, hour and a half, it does get tender enough that it's very easy to eat. And if this was mixed in with something else, if this was in a standard soup, you probably wouldn't even notice it. You would have likely salted it up to that state anyway. So this turned out great. Even though it's not the year-old beef that comes out, which I'm sure would be much harder and that you would have to boil for quite a bit for it to get tender, it's actually quite good. Imagine you're in charge of feeding 200 people. Not only that, but you are at sea for 3 months on a wooden vessel only 120 feet long. How are you going to do this? A 32-gun frigate in the 18th century was a medium-sized warship. This ship is probably 120 or 140 feet long and maximum 30 feet wide, with an array of cannons on board. And this is the kind of ship that goes all over the world to take care of small problems. This isn't the kind of ship that's in a line of battle with, giant battleships all lined up, but they go on independent missions. Now, they have a very challenging environment, especially the cook. The main ship's cook has to cook for all the normal sailors on board as well as the soldiers. And he has to get these men fed in a very, very short period of time, because there is a special cook that does the cooking just for the officers, and then probably a cook just for the captain himself. Moving all these soldiers and sailors over the ocean in this rickety wooden vessel calls for a very complex and rigid system of rules, a tradition that has to extend for centuries. For all this tradition, it's amazing how many people wanted to change the Navy and to change things going on in this late 18th century. So John Cochrane writes this little book called The Seaman's Guide. But basically this book is mostly all about bread and how can we bake bread on board ship. The standard sailor's ration of this time period was a gallon of beer, and every day they would get a pound of ship's biscuits. And ship's biscuits are the hardest bread known to mankind. You can use them to hammer in a nail. The author here thinks that soft bread would be so much better for these sailors. And how can soft bread be baked on board ship? There are different problems with bringing bread on board ship. If we're at sea for months at a time, we can't bring soft bread from on land. It's going to get bad in just a couple of days. Certainly by the first week, it's already starting to turn green. It might sound easy to bake bread at sea, but we have a lot of different kinds of problems. We need to have a fairly large oven, and we need to have the materials. Flour, that's no problem, but yeast is the big problem. And he spends most of the book here talking about the problem of yeast at sea. Bread in Great Britain and North America at the time was mostly baked with a liquid yeast that you got from the brewer. Now that's a problem at sea. There is no brewer right down the street that we can go get our yeast. So how do they do this? How do they leaven bread at sea? What John Cochrane is suggesting here is called either the old dough technique or the leaven technique. And this is a bread method they were using on the continent in Europe, especially France and other places. So this is the typical liquid yeast that people would be making their bread with in Great Britain and North America. They would get this from the brewer and they would get it fresh every time. This might have a little bit of hopsy flavor to it, but mostly it's probably from ale, which doesn't have a lot of hops in it and it wouldn't be very bitter. So what happens if we can't get that? If we're on board ship, then we can use this leaven technique, and we talked about it before. It has to do with taking a lump of dough from a bread baking that you've already done a previous day, 2 or 3 days previously. When you've done this, you tear off a specific section of dough and you leave it behind for your next day's bread, or maybe 2 or 3 days in advance. The yeast will stay alive, and he takes a long time talking about the 3 stages of yeast inside your bread. Now remember, 1797, they did not know what yeast really was. They had no way of understanding exactly its essence. So they just knew that if you used this old dough, that the yeast was still alive in that, and that it would go through these 3 stages of kind of a early fermentation stage, a standard fermentation stage, and then a late stage, which he calls putrid. Bacteria actually starts to live in it, and it gets very sour and almost, well, smelling like rotten bread. That's what happens if we just leave dough around for 3 or 4 days. It starts to go really bad. But he says if we keep feeding this yeast with fresh flour, it will stay in a proper fermentation stage, and we can just keep using it and using it and using it. And so that's the technique that he really wants us to kind of embrace. A technique that was used for hundreds of years over in France and other places in Europe, and even as he was speaking, was starting to be used in places like Edinburgh. I think the reason why in France and other places they're using this old dough technique is because they don't have the fresh yeast either. In that instead of drinking beer and ale, they're drinking wine, and they don't have access to that same kind of yeast. So they are kind of forced to use this old dough technique. For the bread that Cochrane suggested, we have just 4 ingredients, and these are the standard 4 ingredients that every real bread in the 18th century is made out of. We have flour, we have water, we have salt, and we have whatever we're using, leaven or yeast. So I've got flour here and a little bit of salt and water, and then we're gonna take this lump of dough from a couple of days ago and we're going to break it up, and it'll work its way through our entire loaf. To mix our bread, I'm not even gonna do any great quantity of measuring, and they certainly didn't do that in the 18th century. They took a large pile of flour and they start mixing the ingredients in. We are just trying to get to a certain consistency. After that's all kneaded and mixed together, we're going to set it aside to rise, and we'll let that rise for a couple of hours, maybe longer depending on how warm our environment is. And since this old dough, it may be 3 or 4 generations old, it might take a little bit longer, but that's okay. Maybe it might take all evening or an entire day. But it'll work out as long as we give it a little bit of time and where it's not too cold. After it's risen once, we can go ahead and punch that down, knead it a little bit, and let it rise another amount of time. Generally, it doesn't have to rise quite as long that second time, and form it up into our loaf. Then after its second rising, we can put it right into the oven. Depending on the size of your loaf, if you're baking this into a modern oven, I'd go ahead and set it at 400 degrees, and it might bake for 30 minutes. Bread isn't some magical stuff. It is something that just about anybody can make, and I really want to encourage everyone to try this out. It may not be the perfect loaf of bread like you get in the grocery store, but that's not what they had in the 18th century, and that's not real bread anyway. So what is it like on board ship when you are the cook? What is your ship's galley like? As they move into the 18th century, a special kind of galley stove comes into use, especially in the British Navy, and probably something very similar in other navies. We would kind of recognize it as a stove, wood-fired, with an oven on one side and a very large cooking vessel built into this. This is a very dangerous spot in the ship when you have fire going on, and 18th century ships are basically a big match. The vast majority of cooking on board ship, especially for the common sailors and soldiers, is boiling, and that's why they have this large boiling vessel. You can basically fit everything you need to cook for all those 200 men inside of that vessel. Beside that, there is probably a small oven area. We can imagine this being maybe even half the size of an apartment oven, and possibly even an area so that you can roast off to the side. For smaller ships and gunboats, sometimes the ship's galley is just a small brick hearth with the cooking vessel in that. Again, very dangerous. And if you are at sea and it's a rough sea, maybe you have a storm or there's just big waves, you can't start the stove at all. You're going to eat all your food cold. And you hear about sailors complaining about that over and over again. You might have to go days and days with no hot food. The ship's galley is usually located below decks on these larger military vessels, but on smaller commercial vessels, they might have it bolted on the deck so that it's out there in the wind and sometimes in the weather, but it's also a safer location. And these ship's galleys on these smaller ships might only be, say, 4 feet square. Very, very small kitchen area. They were experimenting with some other kinds of cooking vessels in this time period. They had pressure cookers, sometimes called digesters, but they were very dangerous and sometimes exploded because the people didn't know how to use them. It was very important to keep the sailors happy on board ship. After all, without them, the ship can't sail. And especially on board a man of war like this, there are a lot more sailors than there are officers or the captain. And food is a big part of that. So there's a lot of tradition in the food of the sailors. They expected a certain kind of food. And we would look on their rations of a pound of salt pork or a pound of beef and these hard ship's biscuits and maybe a gallon of small beer as very, very unpalatable food. But compared to the food that most standard workmen were eating during the day in the 18th century, this was considered a very good meal. Not everything they're eating on board ship we would recognize as a complete meal, and some of these were very simplistic. One of the great examples of this is burgoo of the 18th century. And a burgoo on board ship is basically a kind of oatmeal. And again, you can see how if you had to feed 200 men, a giant vat of oatmeal might be exactly what you wanted to be able to cook. Burgoo is one of the simplest dishes for the ship's cook to prepare. He's just going to get his cauldron of water nice and hot and then start pouring in his ground oatmeal. And this is something that is not only popular on board ship, but it's standard fare for just about everyone. Ship's biscuit is what Cochrane is trying to replace. This is the mainstay of the diet of a normal sailor in this time frame. And this is so popular that they would have literally thousands of pounds of ship's biscuit on board ship. This would have a lot of different problems though. It had to be made on shore months at a time. And it would come in giant bags that they would have to keep dry on board ship. And that can be difficult to do. So they would have special tin-lined bread rooms to keep the rats out. And even then, they were attacked by weevils. So many times your ship's biscuit would be full of worms when it was time for you to eat them. Ship's biscuit also took up a lot of room compared to just plain flour. So Cochrane said, maybe we can actually take up a lot less room if we just had kegs of flour and you could bake soft bread on board ship instead of using these hard biscuits. Ship's biscuit are also not just edible right away. You just can't eat these. You'll break your teeth immediately. They have to be soaked. Now, some sailors thought this was the only kind of bread to eat, and soft bread would actually mess up your stomach. So they would complain about soft bread and want hard biscuits instead. These biscuits were very, very handy in situations where you could not cook on board ship. If you have a storm and you can't light your stove, you could feed your sailors and they could sustain themselves on nothing but ship's biscuits. I found it very interesting that his concept of using the old dough technique or the leaven technique to make fresh bread on board ship does not take over. It does not get popular in the least. In fact, it kind of goes the other direction. That ship's biscuit continues to be used for 100 years, even more after this book is printed. And even this old dough technique, sourdough, kind of goes out of favor in the 19th century because the industrialization of the yeast process. So yeast starts to become available in little cakes and in dried yeast. So most of the bread bakers, even in Europe, change over to manufactured yeast. Regardless, it's great to dig into these historical documents to understand what people were thinking in the time period, what was actually popular. So he tells us, even though, he wants to change it to something else, we understand what is popular in the time period and what happens to some of these people's ideas. We've got a couple of different sailor meals here. We've got the burgoo, which is, so much a standard meal. And you can imagine this might be the big meal of the day for a sailor. And this is all they're going to have. A little bit of molasses just to sweeten it up. And then a plain, wonderful oatmeal. I'm not sure how I could work all day and that's the only thing I would eat, but sometimes that's what happened. And now we have the big kind of conclusion here. The bread that Cochrane thinks they should have on board versus the bread they did have on board. And let me tell you, ship's biscuit is tough stuff. You can only eat it without doing any kind of preparation by breaking it into tiny little pieces and sticking them in your mouth and sort of letting them dissolve over maybe a half an hour. This one's been soaking and it's certainly soft enough to eat. But this has been soaking for probably more than an hour, and it's still kind of tough. A bread that is hard to believe anyone could survive upon. Cochrane's bread, no, it doesn't have really big voids in it. It's not your classic white bread. It's a little dense because of the way you would have to make it and how the leaven works. And if we tried this over weeks at a time, it would probably be, a good bit fluffier. But I can understand a meal with this as your kind of bread. But how would you ever, on board ship, ever be able to make enough loaves? You would need a loaf like this per man per day. You would need to have huge ovens or spend your entire day and even night baking bread in one of these little tiny ovens. He talks about redesigning the oven to make them bigger, but even then, I can't imagine it would ever work out. And maybe that's one of the reasons why this was never adopted in the Navy.
Imagine you're on a 2-month expedition into the wilderness and all you have to eat is salt pork, dried peas, and ship's biscuit. This is the life of the French voyageur in the late 18th century. They're living a life where they're going into the frontier constantly, going with large boats, large canoes, and going into the frontier to trade for furs with the Native Americans. Rivers and lakes of this time period were the superhighways. They're the way that people can get into the deep frontier in North America to access these markets that they would never be able to get to in any other way. They're using birch bark canoes. They're also using bateaux made of regular wooden planks. They're being manned by these voyageurs and boatmen. And it takes a special kind of person to be able to do this job. You can imagine going into the frontier. It's hard enough to live in the woods, but you also have to paddle or work these boats 12 and 16 hours a day. Some of the most difficult physical labor possible in a very dangerous environment. Our French-Canadian voyageurs are from Quebec, and yet the area they're working within extends much further west, further south, and even further north. The region in which they're working in is huge. They are the long-haul truckers of the late 18th century. Their travels could take them easily 1,000 miles into the wilderness. There are different boats for different jobs, but there are many things that are happening on the frontier. People are taking goods out, sometimes taking people out. At times they're ferrying people across rivers or across large lakes. And it's an arduous job. Now, you're doing this job and you don't have a lot of room for provision, but you have to take along enough to survive upon completely. The food you bring along has to meet a lot of different requirements. It has to be something that's very dense, has a lot of energy in it, is easy to keep in a edible form. It can't be damaged by temperature or a little bit of dampness. It takes a special kind of food to fuel this journey. Your cooking equipment is also a major problem. You can't bring along an entire stove and 14 pots and dishes to do this. It has to be all happening in one pot. So
What meets all these requirements? There's a wonderful journal from 1795 by Isaac Weld, and he travels through the United States and in Lower Canada, and he gives us a wonderful description of this particular setting. He says, on setting out, each man is furnished with a certain allowance of salted pork, biscuit, peas, and brandy. The peas and biscuit they boil with some pork into a porridge, and a large vessel full of it is generally kept at the head of the bateau for the use of the crew when they stop in the course of the day. These men are surviving on this one dish that they make once a day. They boil up salt pork with peas and ship's biscuit into this solid sort of porridge that they can therefore sample all throughout the day to keep them going. Can you imagine this pot full of green, strange porridge in the front of your boat, and whenever you get hungry, you go up and you fill up your bowl, you eat that, and you get right back to work. This might seem like a strange food for us today, and it is to a certain extent. Imagine your boat or your canoe has barrels of salt pork in it, and salt pork is exactly that and nothing else. It is pork that is submerged in salt. And we're using the entire pig at times. You might even find a hog's head in your barrel of salt pork. It's not just a particular cut, but the entire animal. Salt pork was a huge industry in the 18th century because this provision was so important, not only for sailors on the ocean, but for inland provision, like for our voyageurs, or just regular households. Some people are surviving on salt pork the entire year, shunning fresh provisions because they could sell those off at a better price. Salt pork is prepared by butchering your hog and lightly salting the meat, letting all the blood drain out of it. The salt is packed around every single piece and it's tightly put into a barrel. And this salt pork can last for up to a year, possibly longer. There are a few references in the 18th century to people eating their salt pork raw. They basically just knock all the salt off of it and eat it as it is. But that's an emergency kind of setting. I definitely wouldn't suggest that for anyone. Most of our recipes in the 18th century use salt pork, and they soak it in fresh water, changing the water several times to make it less salty. This dish is easy to prepare, but it does have several steps to it. First off, we're going to start off with our salt pork. Our salt pork has to be soaked, and I'm going to soak this salt pork overnight and then cut it up into nice gobbets, a small edible bite-sized piece. This recipe is made to cook up and serve in one vessel. So we're going to start off with cold water, add our salt pork to it, and bring it to a boil. Once that's brought to a boil, we're going to put in our also soaked dried peas. And here we're going to be using split peas. They might have had whole peas. There are times when they might have used beans instead. Again, we have to get those pre-soaked also. Once our pork and our peas are boiling in our vessel, we're just going to leave that boil for an hour or so. And once that's started to break up, then we add our ship's biscuit. And this is going to give us another nice texture in here. The ship's biscuit is another important component to this, and it's going to add a lot of calories to it. It is one of those classic ship's provisions and provision that can be used for a long time, as long as it's kept dry. And here we're going to pound it up into bits. We could pound the ship's biscuit all the way up into a flour and just use it as a thickener, but we're going to leave these chunks a little bigger, and that will give us a nice texture and feel. It doesn't need to boil too long once it's got the ship's biscuit in it. Normally about 20 minutes, a half hour. We don't want to get those ship's biscuits so they're too soft. If you've been on the channel before, you know we've talked about pemmican, and pemmican is really important for the same set of people. But this pemmican is what comes in after this dish. Pemmican actually replaces salt pork in so much of the provision of the voyageurs and the people that are doing that kind of a job. Pemmican is even more dense and more powerful of food to bring along. But salt pork is what there was before pemmican was really discovered to be even better. Isaac Weld, who wrote this text, also describes our voyageurs in great detail. And he gives us some wonderful pictures talking about how they like to sing as they canoe along, about how they sleep at night. They just sleep on the grass with their short blankets. They don't have a blanket that covers themselves. And even when it rains, they just sleep out in the rain. And they really enjoy their job. Even though it's hard, it probably doesn't pay well. Certainly the food doesn't look necessarily delicious, but they would much rather be doing this job than being a simple farmer. It's very interesting to compare the voyageurs to something like the cowboys. The heyday of the cowboy is only like a 10 or a 15-year time period, whereas voyageurs were important from the middle of the 17th century to the middle of the 19th century, an almost 200-year time span when these men working in the frontier were an important part of the economy. When trains and other kinds of transport become popular in the middle of the 19th century, the occupation of the voyageur disappears. Our voyager stew is ready to try out. It's still nice and hot. And you know, it doesn't necessarily look terribly appetizing, but I'll bet after a day of canoeing in the wilderness, this would hit the spot. Well, it's really got some wonderful flavors. You don't need any seasoning or salt. There's enough salt that comes in with the salt pork. The ship's biscuit has still got a wonderful texture in here. It might not look appetizing, but it's very, very good.
A few months ago, we did a wonderful recipe called a sea pie. And the funny thing was, it didn't have any seafood in it at all. Today's pie is just the opposite. It's very fishy. It's called a saltfish pie. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Salt is one of the main preservation techniques of the 18th century. They salted beef, they salted pork, they salted vegetables, they salted fruit. But today's recipe is using salt fish. And with any of these salted things, the weird part is, okay, I preserved it, now it's all really, really salty. How do I use it? How do I cook with it? And finding recipes with these salted provisions can be a little odd because generally they don't talk about that in the cookbooks very much. Today's recipe is a little different. This one uses salt cod. Now, they call it salt fish. Salt fish in the 18th century wasn't always cod, but probably 2/3 of it was salted cod. And most of the salted fish we can still find today, salt cod. Here's the recipe. It's from the Complete Cook, James Jenks, 1769. It does show up in other cookbooks, but I think this one is the best recipe to do for us. It says, lay a side of saltfish in a pan of water till it be tender. Then drain it and lay it upon a dresser. Take off all the skin, pick the meat clean from the bones, mince it small. Take the crumb of 2 French rolls, cut them in slices, boil them up with a quart of new milk. Break the bread very fine with a spoon, to which put the saltfish minced, a pound of melted butter, 2 spoonfuls of parsley shredded very fine, a grated nutmeg, a little beaten pepper, and 3 spoonfuls of mustard. Mix it all well together, make a good crust, lay the paste all over the dish, and lay in the fish and the other ingredients, cover it up, and bake it an hour. So we can see here that we need to deal with this salt fish. We have to get the salt off of it. We have to sort of soak it for a while because saltfish has salt encrusted all over the outside of it. And we need to get rid of that as well as sort of leach out some of the salt that's in the flesh, right? So we can change the water a couple times if we need to. We can even sort of let our saltfish soak too long and take out all the saltiness of it. Some recipes say you might need to actually add salt back in it. I haven't had that problem. Salt cod's pretty darn salty.
Now this definitely does not cut like fresh fish. Let me tell you, this is very firm flesh on this. After the salting, I think all those fibers kind of lock together, and it doesn't seem to matter just how much soaking you do, it's still kind of tough. You know, even the recipe says something like soak it till it's tender. Well, it's never gonna get tender like fresh fish. So it definitely takes mincing. This flesh does not just fall apart. You gotta work it. Once I have this all minced up, then we're gonna start working on the bread and the milk part. We have to take that bread and turn it into breadcrumbs and boil it in milk. Our breadcrumbs have boiled in the milk, and this has turned into a wonderful gloopy mess, which is what we're looking for, right? This is what it should turn into, something like a loose oatmeal. Now we have our other ingredients we're gonna add to this, and we have our parsley that I have chopped fine. Directions call for fine chopping, so we want it to be very broken up, and I'm not sure how much I'm gonna put in here, but I wanna see that color as well as, of course, flavor, the taste of it. This is a boring looking pie with a white fish and, you know, white breadcrumbs, so we want some color in there. We have some pepper that has already been ground up nice and fine, and we can use a good deal of pepper in there. Mustard, something I normally don't put in dishes a lot, but it does show up in the 18th century. We don't know in the recipe whether they're calling for already pre-mixed mustard or ground mustard, but I'm pretty sure in the context that ground mustard is what you want here, not the already prepared like a condiment. So there's our mustard. I think it called for 3 spoonfuls. This is about a half a recipe that we're doing here. It seems like every recipe in the 18th century for a pie makes 2 pies. So we're gonna cut this in half. That was about a spoon and a half. Let's see, we'll mix that up a little bit. We need some nutmeg. Call for a whole nutmeg. We don't need that much nutmeg, but some. That should do it. We don't need a lot of nutmeg in there. We need some melted butter. It calls for a pound of melted butter. Of course, I have here about a half a pound of melted butter. We're starting to get a nice flavorful smell coming out of this. We get the butter, the parsley, the pepper, and even that mustard. Really, really good combination. So I'm excited about seeing where this goes. Before I put the fish in, I want to test it out to see if it got too salty. Yeah, this is uncooked, but you know, it's fish. It's pretty salty. It's not gonna need extra salt. Even though this soaked for quite a while, still pretty salty. So yeah, the fish was a little salty. If you want to pull more of that salt out, you need to change the water more often and heat that up just a little bit. You don't want to boil it in water, but if you heat the water up, it'll help dissolve more of that salt out. You can change the water a couple of different times. Different recipes go over that a little bit more than this one. They figured in this recipe, you already knew how to kind of desalt your fish. So you know, the thing is with this recipe, there's so many more ingredients, all that milk, all the breadcrumbs, some of those other flavors. They're gonna help take the edge off of a little bit too much salt in that. So it's all right if the fish has got a bit of saltiness, because there's so much more to this than just the fish. These are the guts of the pie here. It's ready to go into that. So let me get the pie shell.
Our pie is all assembled and it's ready to go. The recipe calls for 1 hour in the oven. If you're doing this in your modern kitchen, I say 350 degrees ought to do it just about right. So let's get this one in the oven and find out what it turns out like. Our pie's out of the oven, and I wanted this to sort of solidify a little bit so it came out as a nice pie piece. We let it cool off, and now it's ready to try out. Now, if you want it to solidify and you want to eat it when it's still warm, then you might want to slice it and then rewarm those pieces a little bit. But I think this is going to be good whether it's hot or cold. Here's our pie, and boy, out of the oven, smelled great. Very tasty if you like fish pie. So I'm having a hard time describing this one because we don't have any really good equivalent in our modern day foods that we have here in North America. The texture is very kind of nice and smooth on the inside. We get a nice fish flavor that comes in with this. The smoothness and the texture mixed with the fish, it's almost like it's mixed with mashed potatoes. I would, if you gave it to me and I didn't know it was breadcrumbs, yeah, I would say maybe mashed potatoes. And then we get this, there's so much of that bread and the milk in there. Truly, it's like a savory bread pudding that's inside of this pie. So it's really kind of good. Now this is eating it cold, and I think it's very, very edible cold, but I think if it was warmed up, it'd be even better. Maybe think about a crab cake pie. I think that might get us close to the idea of what this is like. If you'd like another great experiment in fish pie, check out this episode. This one was really fun. And thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. The men manning these ships, they were the engine that drove overseas commerce in the 18th century. It couldn't happen without the men doing the work on board these ships, and it was such a tough life, but it had to be done. So many times when we think about 18th century sailors, we're thinking about military sailors and sailors in the Navy. And while there were many sailors in the Navy, there were so many sailors in this civilian trade. They were the long-haul truckers of the 18th century. They made commerce on the seas and on the Great Lakes happen. Without them, nothing happens. There's just, the goods can't go anyplace. Sailors have such a hard life. And they're not the kind of people who are writing down things in journals, are they? The common sailor, he may not even be able to read or write. And even if he did, he doesn't have time during his work a day to make that kind of thing happen. So if we want to learn about sailors in the 18th century, we want to read about them, we have to read about descriptions of them by other people that do have the time to write this down. Nicholas Creswell takes a voyage in 1774 and he gives us a glimpse of what it was like, not only for a passenger, but sometimes what it was like for sailors in the 18th century. Here are just some excerpts from Creswell's writings. He's in 1774, Ship Molly, towards America, Saturday, April 9th, 1774. This morning got up early, got on board about 9 o'clock and set sail with a fair wind and a tide in our favor in the afternoon, and it was calm and pleasant. Sunday, April 10th, 1774. Last night, in attempting to get into my hammock, the hook at the foot gave way, and I have like to broke my bones with the fall
To no small diversion of my fellow passengers, the hammock is a hard piece of canvas suspended up to the roof of the cabin at each end with cords. Wednesday, April 13th, 1774, saw Ireland about 12 leagues distant. Fine, pleasant weather. I believe I've got over my sickness. The next day, Thursday, April 14th, 1774, fresh gales, a large rolling sea, broke our fore-topgallant yard, took our departure from Holyhead. Find I am much deceived, very sick all day. Friday, April 15th, 1774, a fair wind and pleasant. Drank a quart of seawater, which operated both ways very plentifully and did me great service. Spoke a brig from Leghorn bound to Bristol. April 16th, 1774, fair wind and a pleasant weather. We passengers this evening drank our sweethearts in a large can of grog. It was custom at sea on Saturday nights. Very sick indeed. Sunday, April 17th, 1774. Sunday, we, having a parson on board, expected prayers. But instead of praying, he amused himself by reading a treatise on scurvy, while most of the sailors were reading in their common prayer books. I find these men not such an unprincipled set of beings as they are represented to be. It is true they swear most horribly in general, but when they pray, which I believe is very seldom, they do it heartily. Pleasant weather, a good wind, pretty free from sickness. A few days later, Wednesday, April 20th, 1774, pleasant and a fine wind, paid forfeit 1 bottle of rum for going aloft. Pretty well over my sickness, the sea begins to be agreeable. He, as a passenger, also had to do some duty on deck, and so he didn't want to go aloft. He had to pay a bottle of rum to the other sailors to do his duty. Saturday, April 23rd, 1774. Fine, pleasant breeze this morning, but this evening blows hard. I am sick. Sunday, April 24th, 1774. Hard gales from the eastward. The ship rolls and pitches, the worst I have yet experienced. Very often the waves break over the longboat. Broke our mizzen yard. Very sick. Wednesday, April 27th, 1774. Strong gales all day. My sickness continues so bad that I could almost wish myself ashore again. Friday, May 13th, 1774. A fair wind with hazy, cloudy weather at 6 in the evening. Hove the lead, struck ground at 25 fathoms of water. Sandy bottom, but see no land. The very next day, Ship Molly, Chesapeake Bay. Saturday, May 14th, 1774. At 10 o'clock this morning, we made land from the masthead. At 2 afternoon, abreast Cape Henry, from which we see Cape Charles, east-northeast, about 18 miles distant. Got a pilot on board. The land appears low and sandy, covered with pines. Obliged to let our anchor go in 6 fathoms of water at the tail of the Horseshoe. It is a custom with all passengers to pay a bottle of rum to the sailors as soon as they make land. We, agreeable to that custom, have paid ours and believe every man aboard, the captain, passengers, and first mate excepted, are drunk, swearing, and fighting like madmen. So there's Cresswell. He's giving us an idea of what the voyage is like from the passenger's point of view. They have all kinds of weather, very pleasant weather, very rough weather. The sailors, you don't hear about them complaining in this circumstance. They're doing duties. They're getting paid in what they think is their currency, which is rum in this case. They're not getting paid with currency. They're getting what they want most. They have a tremendously difficult job. You can imagine a job where it's 4 hours on, 4 hours off. You never get more than 4 hours worth of sleep, and you might have to come up on deck at any time, day or night, if the weather is tremendously bad and they need every person at the lines to repair or change sail. This job is so very difficult, and some days it's just the most beautiful day ever, and the next day you have the worst storm and you think you're going to die instantly. It's just hard to imagine
today as a normal person living your life, that anyone would live this life day in, day out for years. But it did wear them out early. I love his descriptions though, where when they're working hard, they're working hard, and when they're playing hard, they're playing very hard. The men manning these ships, they were the engine that drove commerce, overseas commerce in the 18th century. Anything that was coming overseas, it couldn't happen without the men doing the work on board these ships, and it was such a tough life, but it had to be done. Special thanks to the great folks here on the Friends Goodwill. This is a tall ship out of South Haven, Michigan, the Michigan Maritime Museum. If you're ever in this southwestern area, southwestern Michigan area, make sure to look it up. This is a true treasure right here on the Great Lakes.
Food preservation is essential for human life, whether it's today, 300 years ago, or 3,000 years ago. On the channel, we've covered all kinds of food preservation, whether it's salt pork, or ship's biscuits, or even smoked meats. There's one other food preservation technique that we have not talked about, and that is keeping the animals alive as long as possible. Now, I talk about life on board ship all the time in regards to food preservation because it's the perfect testing ground. You're away from shore, you're away from land for 7-8 weeks at a time. And it turns out that keeping animals alive on board ship is one of the very things they did for food preservation. So on board a ship, they would have livestock, whether it was a large man of war or just a normal civilian transport. You're going to have small animals and large animals alike. So on board almost any ocean vessel, you'll have all kinds of animals: chickens, sheep, goats, pigs, horses, and cattle. Now, keeping animals alive on board ship is not easy. You'll have to have all kinds of animal fodder, animal feed. They have to have a special area of the ship all to themselves. So you have almost like a barn on board ship. And if it's any large vessel at all with a lot of different sorts of animals, you'll need to have a person specifically in charge of taking care of the animals. So on many ships, they would have a carpenter, and you would call him just the ship's carpenter, and they would also have somebody on board that just took care of the animals. So in the British Navy, that man was called Jeremy Ducks or Jemmy Ducks. So why are they keeping these animals alive as long as possible? So some animals, like the chickens or maybe the goats, they're good for food immediately all the time. So chickens lay eggs, and you don't have to dispatch the chicken so that you've got food. And something like a goat is useful for goat's milk. And having just a simple fresh egg occasionally or a little bit of fresh milk is amazing. Now, most of the people that get to enjoy this fresh food would be captains, officers, even petty officers, or special passengers that would bring their own goods on board ship. And one of the things you would have were your own food resources, and part of that would be the occasional live animal, so that for special occasions, you could have fresh meat. Now, it seems kind of interesting that the passengers would have their own cargo that would come on board, specifically food products, and if an animal came on board ship, they wouldn't have to take care of that animal each and every day. The person who was in charge of the ship's animals would take care of all the animals on board ship, and they would know whose animals those particular ones were. So this one's the captain's sheep, that one's the passenger's chicken. Unfortunately, normal sailors or the low-end passengers probably didn't get to enjoy fresh meat, although I'm sure they wanted to. And we'll talk a little bit about normal ship's provisions here in a second. But what about in situations where you're not on board ship? So you're going out to the frontier, or maybe you're just in a city in colonial America. There were times in the middle of winter when you didn't have other food stocks, and those animals were available for food. And they were hard to keep alive all winter long. Keeping these animals alive was difficult, but it was very, very important. So whether you were in the city or in the country, you wanted to be able to have fresh meat during the winter, and you would have that food preserved by keeping those animals alive. Now, it would seem a no-brainer that you would have these animals on a frontier setting.
and that you would take them out as soon as possible. And that is true, but that doesn't make it easy. In fact, it was very difficult to transport these animals out to the frontier. Think about having a pig. How do you transport a pig out to the frontier? You know, you got to have them in like a cage. You can't really drive pigs very easily. While a cow, you could harness to the back of a wagon or to a pack horse and take out into the frontier. But even then, it's difficult to keep these animals alive unless you already have a very established farm, which basically no one did. They were moving out into, say, a forest setting. You had to bring the food along with you to keep these animals alive. And something like cattle, well, you could almost turn them loose. In fact, if you saw fences in a frontier setting, fences were usually to keep the animals out, not to keep them in like we think of today. So you would keep them out of your fields or keep the animals out from around your house until you wanted them to come in. In William Nolan's memoir, where he talks about frontier life in Michigan, he says that the mosquitoes are actually a good thing early on, that they drove the cattle in at night. They got so bad that the cattle would come in close to the cabin where there were fires always burning because they were kind of trying to clear fields and they were burning trees, and the smoke would keep the mosquitoes down, and they would drive the animals in at night just when they needed to protect them. But protecting animals can be very difficult in that frontier setting. In the city, it was easy. The chickens might just roost in the trees around your house, and you had lots of dogs, and you didn't have to worry about wild animals eating your chickens. But on the frontier, that wasn't true, so you had to work very hard at protecting your chickens because there are all kinds of predators. Again, pigs you would think would be very good on the frontier setting. And if you had no fields, you could just turn them loose into the woods. And basically at the end of the year, when you really needed fresh pork, you could go out and harvest a few of these hogs. But they would turn wild on you and they would be very difficult. So pigs, you really can't keep in with a frontier kind of fence. And so they would destroy any kind of crops that you were trying to grow. And if you had any neighbors nearby, destroy your neighbors' crops, and they would be very angry at you. Even in a frontier setting, like the forts in Kentucky during the Revolutionary War, they're on the very, very bleeding edge of the frontier. And they've got these forts that are protecting them from the Native Americans around them. And yet they have livestock like cows basically running loose around outside the fort. During one of the sieges where the Native Americans were attacking the fort, the Native Americans shot arrows into the cows and drove them back to the fort, hoping that the people in the fort would open up the doors to allow the cows to come in so that they could get in too. You can imagine how important and how wonderful fresh provisions and fresh meat would be on board ship if you think about how bad the ship's provisions could be, especially in the 18th century. Gottlieb Mittelberger has this wonderful pamphlet or little book that he wrote in the 18th century about the travels from Germany to Pennsylvania and back as an indentured servant in 1750 and 1755. He explains the travel on board ship and just how terrible it was. Let me read to you this little section. He says that most of the people get sick is not surprising because in addition to all the other trials and hardships, warm food is served only 3 times a week, the rations being very poor and very little. Such meals can hardly be eaten on account of being so unclean. Toward the end, we were compelled to eat the ship's biscuits, which had been so spoiled long ago that in the whole biscuit there was scarcely a piece the size of $1 that had not been full of red worms and spiders' nests. Gottlieb also helps explain how hard it is to keep animals well during the travels. So on his way back from Pennsylvania to Germany, they ran into 2 storms, 2 very severe storms, one right after they left and one just before they got to land. He says, this gale and the terrible anxiety lasted from 4 o'clock in the evening toward 3 o'clock of the second night when the wind subsided. The ship rocked so violently that it was impossible to cook a meal or to take any comfort. The poultry on board ship was mostly found dead. The pigs and the sheep were sick. The crew of the ship themselves were more dead than alive.
Isn't it interesting that almost nobody really today thinks very much about where their meals are coming from, say tomorrow or next week? We have abundant food resources and food preservation all around us. In the 18th century, they had to think about what was happening next week, a month from now, 6 months from now, to know exactly how to, say, keep your animals alive until March or whatever it takes to survive. I think we can take a page out of this mindset from the 18th century and think a little bit more about what our food is like and where it's coming from.